You've been taught to believe that life should follow the version you planned, that if you love enough, work hard enough, pray enough, and hold on long enough, everything will unfold exactly the way you imagined. But if that were true, why do so many people still feel lost after doing everything right? Why does the future you once trusted suddenly disappear? Why does life sometimes break the dream you built your whole heart around? The truth is, life does not always destroy your plans because it wants to punish you. Sometimes it breaks the version you planned because that version was too small for the person you are becoming. And Buddhist teachings reveal something most people only understand after deep pain. Peace begins when you stop fighting the life that has already changed and start learning how to surrender to what is here. For centuries, Buddhist wisdom has helped people walk through loss, disappointment, betrayal, failure, and uncertainty. Not by teaching them how to force life back into shape, but by showing them how to trust the path even when the old map no longer works. This is the kind of surrender that quiets the mind, softens the heart, and helps you breathe again when the future you wanted is no longer in front of you. Tonight, as you listen to these teachings, something inside you will begin to loosen. The pressure to understand everything, the fear of starting over, the grief of what did not happen, and the pain of watching your old dream fade away will slowly begin to lose their power. Your mind will become calmer, your heart will begin to feel lighter, and you may start to see that life was not ending your story. It was only ending the version that could no longer carry you forward. This is not just another audio to fall asleep to. This is a quiet return to trust after life breaks the plan you thought you needed. Are you ready? Let's begin. And this is where the real pain begins. Not the pain of losing a thing, but the pain of losing the future you secretly built your entire heart around. Because there are moments in life when something does not simply end, it collapses. A relationship, a dream, a plan, a version of yourself you were already emotionally living inside. And when that future disappears, it can feel like part of your identity disappears with it. What hurts the most is not always what happened. Sometimes what hurts the most is realizing the life you kept waiting for is never coming back in the form you imagined. That is the hidden grief so many people carry in silence. There is a kind of sadness that nobody prepares you for. It is not loud. It does not always make you cry in front of people. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion. Sometimes it looks like staring at the ceiling at night, replaying old conversations, old plans, old hopes. Sometimes it feels like waking up in the morning and remembering all over again that life did not turn out the way you thought it would. The human mind becomes deeply attached to imagined futures. Long before something actually happens, the heart begins living there emotionally. You picture the relationship lasting forever. You picture the career finally giving you fulfillment. You picture the family staying together. You picture the future version of yourself becoming happy once everything finally falls into place. And slowly, without realizing it, your emotional survival becomes connected to that future. This is why the collapse of a dream can feel so unbearable. It is not only disappointment, it feels like emotional death. Because the mind is not grieving an idea. It is grieving an entire identity that no longer exists. Buddhist teachings explain that attachment is not only attachment to people or possessions, it is also attachment to expectations, attachment to stories, attachment to imagined outcomes. The suffering becomes deep because the mind says, "This was supposed to happen, this was supposed to be my life." And when reality moves in a different direction, the heart enters a war with what is. That war is exhausting. Many people spend years emotionally fighting reality without even realizing it. Their body moves forward, but their mind remains trapped in an old future that no longer exists. They replay the breakup that happened 3 years ago. They replay the opportunity they lost. They replay the version of life they thought would save them. Outwardly, they continue living, but inwardly, they are still standing in front of a closed door, begging life to reopen it. This is why some pain never leaves quickly, because people are not only grieving what they lost, they are grieving who they thought they would become through that thing. A person who loses a relationship is often not just grieving the partner, they are grieving the future, family they imagined, the growing old together, the holidays, the emotional safety, the version of themselves that felt loved. A person who loses a career dream is not just grieving the job, they are grieving the identity, the recognition, the meaning they believed would finally make them feel worthy. The hidden grief lives inside the collapse of emotional projection. And what makes this suffering even harder is that the world often rushes people to move on before they have emotionally understood what actually died inside them. People say things like, "Everything happens for a reason," or "You'll find something better," while your heart still feels like it is standing in the ashes of a life you deeply loved before it even existed. Sometimes the grief is invisible because nothing physically died. Nobody sees that the person is mourning a future. Nobody sees the emotional funeral happening quietly inside them. There are people walking around every day, smiling, working, talking normally, while secretly grieving the life they thought they would have by now. The marriage they expected, the peace they expected, the success they expected, the child they expected, the version of themselves they thought they would become. And because this grief has no visible coffin, many people feel ashamed of it. They tell themselves they should be over it already. They judge themselves for still hurting. But Buddhist wisdom teaches something important here. Pain becomes heavier when you refuse to honor it honestly. You cannot heal grief you keep pretending does not exist. The heart needs space to mourn properly, not forever, but honestly. Because surrender does not begin with pretending nothing hurts. It begins by finally admitting, "This broke me more than I wanted to admit." That honesty is sacred. One of the deepest forms of suffering happens when your outer life continues, but your inner world still cannot accept what changed. You continue waking up every day, but emotionally, you still keep waiting for reality to reverse itself somehow. A message, a miracle, a second chance, some sign that the old future can still return. This creates emotional limbo. And limbo is painful because the soul is trapped between what was and what now is. One part of you sees reality clearly, another part still refuses to release the dream. That inner conflict creates exhaustion, anxiety, overthinking, and emotional numbness. Many people think surrender means instantly accepting pain peacefully, but real surrender is usually much messier than that. At first, surrender often looks like crying over the same thing again and again because the mind keeps trying to emotionally negotiate with reality. It keeps asking, what if I had done this differently? What if I waited longer? What if life made a mistake? The mind searches for control because control feels safer than grief. But eventually, something begins to happen. The exhaustion of resisting reality becomes heavier than the fear of letting go. And this is where transformation quietly begins. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when we cling to impermanent things as though they were guaranteed. The painful truth is that life changes constantly. Relationships change, bodies change, dreams change, people change. Entire identities can disappear within a single season of life. The ego hates this truth because the ego wants permanence. It wants certainty. It wants guarantees. It wants life to obey the emotional script it created. But life has never promised permanence. And strangely, much of human suffering comes from demanding permanence from a temporary world. This does not mean you should stop loving deeply or hoping deeply. It means you must stop believing that your peace can only exist if life unfolds exactly the way you planned. Because sometimes the future you wanted was built from a limited version of yourself. Sometimes you created dreams from wounds you had not healed yet. Sometimes the thing you thought would complete you was actually something you were using to avoid yourself. This is difficult to accept at first. When a dream dies, the immediate reaction is usually, "My life is ruined." But years later, many people look back and realize the collapse changed them in necessary ways. It humbled them, softened them, awakened them, forced them to face parts of themselves they would have avoided forever if life had remained comfortable. Pain has a strange ability to expose illusions. Sometimes you do not realize how emotionally dependent you became on a future until it disappears. You realize how much of your worth was connected to being chosen, successful, admired, needed, validated, or secure. And when life removes those things, it feels like you disappear too. This is why identity collapse can feel so terrifying. Without the old dream, who are you? Without the relationship, who are you? Without the career, the title, the plan, the certainty, the future you emotionally worshipped, who are you? Most people spend their entire lives trying to answer that question externally, but Buddhist teachings slowly guide you inward instead. They teach that peace cannot be built on temporary conditions because temporary things will always change. Real peace begins when your identity no longer depends entirely on what life gives or takes away. This is not cold detachment, it is emotional freedom. The problem is that many people never learned how to exist without constantly attaching themselves to future outcomes. They postpone their happiness until life finally becomes what they expected. I'll feel okay when this relationship works. I'll feel worthy when I succeed. I'll feel peaceful when everything makes sense. But life keeps changing the conditions. And if your peace depends on conditions staying perfect, anxiety becomes unavoidable. This is why surrender is not weakness. It is the painful process of learning how to stop emotionally collapsing every time life changes shape. There comes a moment in deep grief where you realize no amount of overthinking can bring the old future back. No amount of sadness can rewrite reality. No amount of emotional resistance can force life to become what it was before. And strangely, that realization can become the beginning of freedom, not because the pain disappears immediately, but because the fight begins to soften. You stop asking life to rewind. You stop demanding answers for every loss. You stop treating uncertainty like an enemy. And slowly, the heart begins learning how to live again. Not the old life, not the imagined life, but the life that is here now. That shift is one of the hardest emotional transitions a human being can experience because the mind always wants to return to what felt familiar. Even painful familiarity can feel safer than uncertain transformation. This is why many people secretly remain emotionally attached to dead chapters. The old dream may have hurt them, but at least it gave them identity. At least it gave them direction. Letting go feels terrifying because now they must face the unknown version of themselves waiting on the other side. And yet, hidden inside this painful season is something sacred. When the old future dies, space opens for a deeper relationship with life itself. Not a relationship built on control, but on trust. Not trust that life will always give you what you want, but trust that you can survive transformation without losing your soul. That trust changes everything, because eventually you begin understanding something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Life was never meant to stay frozen for your comfort. Life moves, life changes, life removes, life rebuilds. And every season, even the painful ones, carries lessons the comfortable seasons could never teach. The grief of losing old dreams is real. Buddhism never asks you to deny that pain. It asks you to stop becoming imprisoned by it. There is a difference. One allows grief to move through you honestly. The other turns grief into your permanent identity. And many people unconsciously choose the second path because holding on to old pain feels easier than entering an unknown future. But healing begins when you finally allow reality to be real, not because you suddenly like what happened, not because the loss suddenly feels fair, but because fighting reality forever only deepens suffering. At some point, the soul becomes tired of carrying dead futures, and maybe that exhaustion is not failure. Maybe it is the beginning of surrender. And when the soul becomes tired of carrying dead futures, the next pain often rises quietly from underneath. It is the question that keeps the wound open. It is the question the mind repeats when reality feels too sharp to accept. Why me? Why did this happen to me? Why did life choose my heart, my dream, my plan, my peace to break? That question feels innocent at first, but if you stay inside it too long, it becomes a prison. Because the mind that keeps asking, why me, is not really searching for wisdom. It is searching for a way to argue with what already happened. There is a moment after life disappoints you when the pain itself is not the only thing hurting you. The deeper suffering comes from the fight you begin having with reality. Something happened. Something changed. Something ended. But instead of meeting the pain as it is, the mind begins building a courtroom inside you. It wants evidence. It wants explanations. It wants someone to blame. It wants life to defend itself. And this is where suffering becomes heavier, because pain is what happens when life wounds you, but suffering grows when the mind refuses to stop reopening the wound. Pain says, this hurts. Suffering says, this should not have happened. This is unfair. I cannot accept this. My life was not supposed to be this way. Pain is the first arrow. Suffering is the second arrow you keep shooting into yourself through resistance. Buddhist teachings often speak about this difference. The first arrow is the event itself, the loss, the betrayal, the failure, the heartbreak, the disappointment, the sudden collapse of the future you trusted. That arrow hurts because you are human. It is natural. It is real. But the second arrow is the story the mind creates after the pain arrives. I am cursed. I am unlucky. I am being punished. I will never recover. Everyone else gets what they want except me. That second arrow can hurt even more than the first. Because now you are not only experiencing what happened, you are living inside a war against what happened. This is why me can become dangerous when it is repeated without awareness. It can make you feel as if life has singled you out for suffering. It can make your pain feel personal in a way that traps you deeper inside it. Instead of seeing pain as part of the human condition, the mind begins to see pain as proof that something is wrong with you, wrong with your destiny, wrong with your worth, wrong with your entire life. And once the mind believes that, every painful event becomes a message of rejection. A relationship ending no longer feels like a relationship ending. It feels like life saying you are not lovable. A failure no longer feels like a failure. It feels like life saying you are not capable. A delay no longer feels like a delay. It feels like life saying you have been forgotten. The mind takes one painful event and turns it into a whole identity of abandonment. This is how suffering deepens. Not because the event itself keeps happening, but because the mind keeps giving it new meanings that cut even deeper. You may have noticed this inside yourself before. Something painful happens, and for a while you are not just hurt by the event. You are hurt by all the thoughts that follow it. You begin asking why it had to happen now, why it had to happen this way, why you did not see it coming, why others seem to move through life more easily, why your own path seems so difficult. And if you are not careful, the mind begins comparing wounds. You look at other people and think they are living the life you were denied. You see someone in a happy relationship, and your loss becomes sharper. You see someone succeeding, and your failure feels louder. You see someone peaceful, and your own confusion feels like a punishment. The mind says, why them and not me? And now the pain has multiplied again. This comparison is another form of resistance. Because you are no longer simply grieving your own life. You are now fighting everyone else's life too. You are arguing with the way things are distributed. You are measuring your pain against someone else's appearance. You are using another person's visible blessing to deepen your private wound, even though you do not know what they are carrying behind closed doors. Buddhist wisdom invites you to step out of that comparison because comparison rarely leads to peace. It usually feeds the illusion that everyone else received a softer life while you were handed the harder road. But every human being meets suffering in some form. Some people lose love, some lose health, some lose direction, some lose inner peace while still looking successful. Some lose themselves slowly while the world keeps clapping for them. Suffering is not proof that life hates you. It is proof that you are alive in a world that changes. But when you keep asking, "Why me?" from a place of resistance, you make suffering feel like a personal attack instead of a painful part of existence. You begin to believe your pain should not belong to you. And while that thought may feel understandable, it keeps you trapped because the mind cannot heal what it keeps rejecting. Acceptance does not mean saying what happened was good. It does not mean saying it was fair. It does not mean saying you deserved it. Acceptance means you stop adding another layer of war on top of the wound. You stop using your energy to deny what is already true. You stop standing in front of reality, exhausted and bleeding, demanding that it become yesterday again. That is where surrender begins. Many people misunderstand surrender because they think it means losing. They think surrender means becoming passive, weak, or silent. But in Buddhist practice, surrender is not giving up your life. It is giving up the unnecessary fight with reality. It is. The moment you stop saying, "This should not be happening," and begin saying, "This is happening, so how do I meet it with wisdom?" That shift changes the whole inner atmosphere. When you ask, "Why me?" with resistance, the mind becomes tight, the body becomes tense, the heart becomes defensive. But when you ask, "What is this pain asking me to see?" something opens, not immediately, not perfectly, but gently. The question moves from self-pity into self-awareness. It stops being a weapon and becomes a doorway. This does not mean you should rush into lessons before you have felt the grief. That would be another form of avoidance. Some people try to spiritualize pain too quickly. They say, everything is a lesson, while their heart is still shattered and begging to be heard. But real Buddhist surrender is not emotional bypassing. It does not ask you to smile while you are breaking. It asks you to become honest enough to see both truths at once. This hurts, and I do not have to turn the hurt into hatred toward life. That is a mature kind of strength, because when the mind keeps asking, "Why me?" it often wants one thing, a reason that will make the pain acceptable. But some pain will never become acceptable to the part of you that wanted life to be different. Some endings will never feel fair. Some betrayals will never make complete sense. Some losses will never receive the perfect explanation your mind is demanding. And this is difficult but necessary to understand. Sometimes the need for an explanation becomes another attachment. You become attached to finding the reason, attached to solving the mystery, attached to knowing why. You believe that if you can finally understand why it happened, the pain will release you. But sometimes the mind receives an answer and still keeps suffering because what it really wanted was not understanding. It wanted reversal. It wanted the past to change. It wanted the old dream to return. This is why answers alone do not always heal. A person can know why a relationship ended and still grieve it. A person can understand why a door closed and still feel abandoned. A person can see the lesson and still miss the life they wanted. Healing is not only about explanation. Healing is about ending the inner argument with reality. That inner argument is subtle. It hides inside thoughts like, "I should have known better. I should have chosen differently. I should have seen the signs. I should have been stronger." The mind begins turning pain into self-blame because blaming yourself can feel like control. If it was your fault, then maybe you can prevent all future pain by becoming perfect. But this is another trap. You cannot become so perfect that life never changes. You cannot become so careful that no one ever disappoints you. You cannot become so wise that you never face uncertainty. The desire to control every future wound is still resistance. It is the mind trying to build a wall around the heart so life can never reach it again. But a heart behind a wall may avoid some pain, yet it also loses tenderness, love, openness, and trust. That is not peace. That is fear wearing armor. Buddhist teachings point toward a different freedom, not the freedom of controlling life, but the freedom of no longer being controlled by your reaction to life. This is why awareness matters so deeply. When pain comes, awareness helps you notice the story forming around it. It helps you see when the mind is turning disappointment into identity, delay into rejection, uncertainty into disaster, and loss into proof that your life is ruined. Awareness creates a small space, and in that space, suffering begins to loosen. You may still feel sadness, you may still feel confusion, you may still wish things had happened differently, but you are no longer completely swallowed by the story. You can say, "This hurts," without saying, "This will destroy me." You can say, "I do not understand," without saying, "Life is against me." You can say, "I am grieving," without turning grief into a permanent home. That is the beginning of emotional freedom. The mind trapped in "why me" often wants life to become fair before it becomes peaceful. But life may not always offer the kind of fairness the ego understands. Sometimes good people face painful endings. Sometimes sincere effort does not bring the result you hoped for. Sometimes love is not returned. Sometimes plans collapse even when your intentions were pure. This truth can feel cruel at first, but it can also become liberating. Because if life is not always controlled by personal deserving, then your pain is not always a verdict against you. It is not always proof that you failed. It is not always punishment for something you did wrong. Sometimes painful things happen because causes and conditions came together in ways beyond your control. People act from their own wounds. Opportunities shift, bodies age, circumstances change, timing fails. The world moves according to many forces, not only your hopes. This is one of the hardest Buddhist truths to accept. Not everything that happens is personal. The ego wants everything to be personal because that gives the ego a central place in the story. It says, "This happened to me because of me," but reality is wider than that. Your pain is personal because you feel it deeply, but the causes of that pain may be far more complex than your mind can ever fully trace. When you begin to see this, the question changes. Instead of, "Why did life do this to me?" you begin asking, "How do I stop making this pain heavier than it already is?" That question carries wisdom. It does not deny the wound. It simply refuses to keep pouring poison into it. And one of the poisons we pour into pain is resentment. Resentment feels powerful at first because it gives pain a direction. It gives the mind someone to aim at. But over time, resentment becomes a chain. It keeps you emotionally tied to the thing that hurt you. You may think you are holding anger, but often anger is holding you. It keeps the person, the event, the betrayal, or the disappointment alive inside your nervous system long after it is gone from your daily life. This is why forgiveness is often misunderstood too. Forgiveness does not mean pretending nothing happened. It does not mean allowing people to harm you again. It does not mean removing boundaries. In the deeper sense, forgiveness means you stop allowing the wound to keep living as the center of your inner world. You stop feeding the fire that burns you from the inside. But before forgiveness, there must be honesty. You cannot release what you have not admitted. You cannot soften what you keep denying. You cannot surrender what you are still pretending did not matter. So the path is not to rush yourself out of pain. The path is to sit with pain without letting it become your entire identity. This is where Buddhist mindfulness becomes practical. When the thought, "Why me?" appears, you do not have to attack it. You do not have to shame yourself for thinking it. You simply notice it. This is the mind asking why. This is the mind trying to escape the pain. This is the mind looking for control. That simple noticing already weakens the thought. You are no longer the thought. You are the awareness that sees it. That difference is powerful. The thought says, "This should not have happened." Awareness says, "A thought of resistance is here." The thought says, "My life is ruined." Awareness says, "A fear about the future is here." The thought says, "I cannot survive this." Awareness says, "A wave of fear is moving through me." When you practice this, you stop becoming every storm that passes through your mind. You begin to see that thoughts are events too. They arise, they stay for a while, they change, they disappear, just like emotions, just like seasons, just like the plans you once thought would last forever. This is not easy at first because suffering feels convincing. When the mind is hurting, its stories sound true. The voice of fear can sound like wisdom. The voice of resentment can sound like justice. The voice of despair can sound like honesty. But with practice, you begin to see that not every thought deserves your belief. Some thoughts are just pain speaking, and pain is allowed to speak, but it does not need to lead your whole life. There is also a hidden pride inside the question, "Why me?" Not the obvious kind of pride, but the quiet belief that life should have spared you from certain forms of suffering. This is not something to judge yourself for. It is human. We all carry some version of it. We all secretly hope our love, goodness, effort, or careful planning will protect us from heartbreak. But life does not always work that way. Buddhist wisdom softens this pride by reminding us that suffering is not a personal exception. It is part of being human. Birth, aging, sickness, loss, change, separation, disappointment, uncertainty. These are woven into life. Not because life is cruel, but because everything conditioned is unstable. When you understand this, your pain may not vanish, but your loneliness inside the pain begins to soften. You are no longer the only one. You are part of a human story that has been unfolding for thousands of years. People before you have lost dreams. People before you have buried futures. People before you have sat in the dark, asking why. And somehow, many of them found a way to keep breathing, keep loving, keep waking up, keep becoming. This matters because suffering often isolates you. It whispers, "No one understands." And maybe no one understands the exact shape of your wound, but many understand the ache of having life turn in a direction they never chose. Many understand the silence after a plan collapses. Many understand the shock of waking up inside a reality they never wanted. Compassion begins there. Not only compassion for others, but compassion for yourself. Instead of attacking yourself for struggling, you begin saying, "Of course this hurts. Of course I feel shaken. Of course my mind is searching for reasons." That gentleness does not make you weak. It keeps your heart from hardening. And this is important because resistance often makes people harsh with themselves. They think healing should be faster. They think acceptance should be immediate. They think spiritual growth means never feeling angry, confused, or disappointed. But true surrender is not a clean, perfect moment. It is often a slow returning. Again and again, the mind resists, and again, you come back to reality with a little more softness. You come back to the breath, you come back to the body, you come back to the present moment, you come back to the simple truth that this moment is the only place where healing can happen. The past cannot be changed inside the past. The future cannot be controlled from your fear. But here, in this breath, you can stop adding another layer of suffering. Here, you can stop feeding the war. Here you can say, "I do not like what happened, but I will not let my resistance destroy the life that remains." That is not a small thing. That is a turning point. Because life after disappointment is not only about understanding why something happened. It is about learning how to live without the answer controlling you. It is about becoming someone who can hold unanswered questions without becoming bitter. Someone who can feel pain without worshipping it. Someone who can lose a plan without losing the whole self. And maybe this is where the question, "Why me?" finally begins to dissolve. Not because you found the perfect explanation, but because you no longer need the question to protect you. You no longer need it to prove your pain. You no longer need it to keep the old story alive. You begin to see that the deeper question was never, why me? The deeper question was, can I meet this life as it is without abandoning myself? That is where Buddhist surrender becomes real. Not in the moment when life becomes easy again, but in the moment when you stop demanding that life become easy before you choose peace. Not in the moment when every answer arrives, but in the moment when you stop making your peace wait for every answer. Not in the moment when pain disappears, but in the moment when you stop turning pain into a battlefield. Because the truth is, resistance does not protect you from what happened. It only keeps you trapped inside it. And when the mind finally grows tired of fighting a reality that has already arrived, something quiet begins to open, a small space, a softer breath, a deeper willingness, not happiness yet, not full peace yet, but the first sign that the war inside you is losing its power. From that space, you can begin to see clearly. The question is no longer, why did life break my plan? The question becomes, what part of me is still trying to force life to obey my timeline? And that question leads us deeper into the next teaching, because beneath so much anxiety, grief, and resistance is one hidden belief, that life should move according to our control. And maybe that is the deeper truth hidden underneath so much human suffering. The mind does not only want life to feel good, it wants life to feel controllable. It wants guarantees. It wants certainty. It wants to know exactly when things will happen, how they will happen, and what the ending will look like. But the more tightly the mind tries to control life, the more anxious it becomes when life refuses to obey. Because beneath almost every fear is one silent demand. Life must happen according to my timeline. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes from trying to manage every part of your future. It does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like overthinking every decision before you sleep. Sometimes it looks like checking your phone again and again, hoping for a message that changes everything. Sometimes it looks like constantly planning 5 years ahead because the present moment feels too uncertain to sit inside peacefully. And slowly, without realizing it, your mind becomes addicted to control. Not because control truly brings peace, but because uncertainty feels terrifying to the ego. The ego believes that if it can predict life, organize life, and force life into a clear structure, then pain can finally be avoided. It says, if I plan enough, I will be safe. If I think hard enough, nothing will surprise me. If I control enough outcomes, I will never feel this helpless again. But life does not move according to human control. This is one of the hardest truths Buddhism asks you to face. Everything changes, everything moves, everything remains uncertain, and no amount of mental force can fully protect you from that reality. At first, the mind resists this truth because it sounds frightening. The ego hears uncertainty and immediately translates it into danger. But Buddhist wisdom teaches something very different. The real danger is not uncertainty itself. The real danger is exhausting your entire life trying to escape uncertainty, because that escape never ends. Even when things go well, the anxious mind still worries. Even when love arrives, it fears losing it. Even when success appears, it fears failure returning. Even when peace enters your life, the mind asks how long it will last. This is because anxiety is not always created by what is happening now. Much of anxiety comes from trying to secure a future that cannot be fully controlled. You see this everywhere. People destroy their present peace trying to guarantee future happiness. They cannot enjoy love because they are already afraid of abandonment. They cannot enjoy success because they are already afraid of failure. They cannot enjoy rest because they feel guilty for not controlling every possible outcome ahead of time. The nervous system becomes trapped in constant preparation, always preparing for loss, always preparing for disappointment, always preparing for uncertainty, and eventually the body begins carrying the weight of futures that have not even happened yet. This is why so many people feel exhausted even when nothing visibly terrible is happening. Their mind is fighting imaginary futures all day long. They are mentally rehearsing disasters, mentally controlling conversations, mentally predicting rejection, mentally trying to force certainty into an uncertain world. That inner pressure becomes unbearable over time. Buddhist teachings explain that suffering grows whenever attachment grows, and one of the deepest attachments human beings carry is attachment to control. Not just control over situations, but control over timing. People do not only want things to happen, they want things to happen when they want them to happen. I should be married by now. I should have succeeded by now. I should be healed by now. My life should look different by now. The ego creates invisible deadlines for happiness, and when life does not obey those deadlines, anxiety appears, shame appears, panic appears. The mind begins comparing itself to others. It begins feeling left behind. It begins treating life like a race that is being lost. But life was never designed to unfold according to one universal timeline. Some people find love early and lose it later. Some struggle for years before finally finding peace. Some dreams arrive slowly. Some doors close unexpectedly. Some people awaken spiritually only after everything they depended on collapses. Human lives unfold differently because human journeys are different. The problem begins when you believe your peace depends on life moving according to your personal schedule. This creates constant emotional warfare with reality. The mind keeps saying, "This should already be happening." Reality says, "Not yet." The mind says, "This should not be happening." Reality says, "But it is." The mind says, "Life must go this way." Reality continues moving in its own direction. That conflict creates anxiety. Not because life is always attacking you, but because the ego is constantly fighting what it cannot control. One of the deepest Buddhist truths is that control itself is often an illusion. Human beings have influence, effort, intention, and choice, but very little absolute control. You can love someone deeply and still lose them. You can plan carefully and still face uncertainty. You can take care of your body and still become sick. You can do everything right and still experience painful endings. This truth can sound hopeless at first, but it becomes liberating once understood correctly, because if complete control was never truly possible, then you can finally stop blaming yourself for failing to control everything. You can stop carrying the impossible burden of trying to guarantee outcomes life never promised. That burden is crushing so many people. Some people spend years trying to emotionally manage everyone around them so they never feel abandoned. Some try to control how others see them so they never feel rejected. Some obsess over productivity because they think constant achievement will finally secure their worth. Some overthink every choice because they believe one wrong decision could destroy their future forever. But no human being can fully control how life unfolds, and strangely, accepting this creates more peace than fighting against it. Because when you stop demanding total control, you finally create space for trust. Not blind trust that everything will always go perfectly, but deeper trust that you can survive uncertainty without collapsing internally. That trust changes the nervous system. It softens the body, it softens the mind, it allows you to breathe again. Many people do not realize how deeply fear controls their timeline. They think they are simply being responsible, ambitious, or careful, but underneath the endless planning is often fear. Fear of falling behind, fear of missing out, fear of being forgotten, fear of failure, fear of uncertainty. The ego says, if I can control the future, I can finally relax. But the future keeps moving, and so relaxation never arrives. This is why some people reach their goals and still feel restless. They thought control would finally bring peace, but the anxious mind simply finds a new thing to control, a new fear, a new outcome, a new future problem to solve. The cycle continues endlessly because the root problem was never the external situation. The root problem was attachment to certainty. Buddhist surrender interrupts this cycle. It gently asks you to stop building your entire emotional stability on things that are constantly changing. It asks you to stop treating uncertainty as proof that something is wrong. It asks you to stop measuring your worth through timelines created by fear, comparison, or social pressure. Because life is not a machine obeying your emotional demands. Life moves organically, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes beautifully, sometimes in ways your current self cannot yet understand. And one of the greatest sources of human anxiety is trying to force life to reveal answers before their season has arrived. The mind hates waiting. Waiting feels powerless to the ego because the ego wants movement, certainty, reassurance, proof. It wants visible progress. It wants guarantees that the future will reward all your effort. But life often unfolds invisibly before it unfolds visibly. Seeds grow underground long before anything appears above the surface. Yet the anxious mind keeps digging the soil open every day, asking, why is nothing happening yet? This constant mental interference destroys peace. There is a deep exhaustion that comes from never allowing life to breathe naturally. Some people monitor every relationship constantly. Some obsess over every small emotional shift. Some panic the moment life becomes unclear. They immediately try to force solutions, force clarity, force certainty. But not every season of life is meant to feel clear. Some seasons are meant to teach patience. Some are meant to teach trust. Some are meant to teach you who you become when control is no longer possible. This is why spiritual growth often begins when control fails. As long as the ego believes it can dominate every outcome, surrender feels unnecessary. But eventually life brings situations that cannot be controlled through intelligence, effort, manipulation, overthinking, or force. A person leaves, a dream collapses, a body changes, a future disappears, and suddenly the ego meets its limit. That moment feels terrifying because the mind realizes something it spent years trying to avoid. Control was never as absolute as it imagined. This realization can create panic at first, but eventually it can create freedom too. Because once you stop trying to dominate every unknown outcome, you begin experiencing life differently. You begin listening more instead of forcing. You begin observing more instead of panicking. You begin responding instead of reacting. You stop gripping life so tightly, and something inside you softens. Many people confuse surrender with passivity because they think surrender means doing nothing. But Buddhist surrender is not laziness. It is wise participation without emotional obsession. You still make effort. You still take action. You still care deeply. But you stop demanding absolute control over results. That difference matters deeply. A surrendered person may still work hard, but their identity is not destroyed if the outcome changes. A surrendered person may still love deeply, but they do not try to imprison people emotionally out of fear. A surrendered person may still plan for the future, but they understand plans are temporary maps, not permanent guarantees. This creates emotional flexibility, and emotional flexibility is one of the healthiest forms of strength. Rigid minds break easily because they cannot adapt when life changes shape. Flexible minds bend, adjust, grieve, learn, and continue moving. Buddhism teaches this flexibility through non-attachment, not detachment from love or life, but detachment from the illusion that reality must obey your exact expectations in order for you to remain whole. The anxious ego says, I can only be okay if things happen my way. Wisdom says, I can remain grounded even when life changes. That is a completely different way of living. It does not remove pain from life, but it removes much unnecessary suffering, because much suffering comes from demanding that uncertainty disappear before you allow yourself to feel safe. But uncertainty is part of existence itself. Even the people who seem secure are living inside uncertainty. Relationships are uncertain. Health is uncertain. Money is uncertain. Human emotions are uncertain. The future is uncertain. And yet, despite this truth, many people still postpone their peace until certainty finally arrives. That day never comes. There will always be another unknown, another possibility, another risk, another change waiting around the corner. So if your peace depends on certainty, peace remains permanently delayed. This is why Buddhist practice teaches presence so strongly. Presence interrupts the mind's addiction to future control. It brings awareness back to what is actually here now, instead of what might happen later. Right now, in this breath, you are alive. Right now, the mind may be creating stories about tomorrow that do not yet exist. Right now, your suffering may be coming less from reality itself and more from resistance toward uncertainty. Awareness helps you notice this. You begin catching the mind, creating timelines constantly. I need this to happen soon. I cannot relax until this changes. My life should already be somewhere else. These thoughts create pressure inside the nervous system because they turn life into a constant emergency. The body begins living as though peace is always somewhere in the future, always one achievement away, one relationship away, one answer away. But peace cannot survive in a mind constantly trying to outrun the present moment. This does not mean you stop caring about your future. It means you stop sacrificing your entire inner life trying to control it. There is wisdom in effort. There is suffering in obsession. And many people do not realize when healthy effort becomes fearful control. The difference is often emotional rigidity. When your identity becomes dependent on one specific outcome happening exactly the way you imagined, anxiety becomes inevitable because reality rarely moves in perfect straight lines. Sometimes delays protect you, sometimes rejection redirects you, sometimes confusion slows you down long enough for deeper transformation to happen. But the controlling mind cannot see this because it only trusts visible certainty. It cannot yet trust the intelligence of life unfolding gradually. This is why surrender feels so uncomfortable initially. Surrender removes the illusion that you can mentally force life into obedience. It leaves you face to face with uncertainty. And the ego interprets uncertainty as danger because uncertainty exposes how little control it truly has. But hidden inside uncertainty is also openness, possibility, transformation, unexpected paths. Many beautiful things in human life arrive unplanned: deep love, spiritual awakening, inner peace, wisdom, new direction. Some of the most meaningful experiences enter through doors the controlling mind would never have chosen. Yet fear keeps trying to close those doors before life can move through them. You see this in relationships often. A person becomes so afraid of losing someone that they begin controlling everything, monitoring reactions, overanalyzing texts, seeking constant reassurance, trying to guarantee permanence. But this pressure slowly suffocates the relationship itself because fear is now controlling love. The same thing happens internally. A person becomes so afraid of uncertainty that they lose the ability to live openly. Every unknown becomes a threat. Every delay becomes panic. Every unexpected turn becomes emotional catastrophe. This is not living. It is surviving inside constant mental resistance. Buddhist teachings invite you out of that survival state slowly, not by forcing positivity, but by helping you see clearly. You begin understanding that life has always been uncertain, even during your most stable seasons. The illusion was never that uncertainty disappeared. The illusion was that you believed certainty was guaranteed. Once this becomes clear, your relationship with control begins changing. You stop trying to dominate every future outcome. You stop needing immediate answers for every fear. You stop measuring your life against rigid timelines. You stop forcing emotional certainty where none exists. And slowly the nervous system begins unclenching. There is more breathing room inside you, more patience, more acceptance, more trust. Not because life suddenly becomes predictable, but because you no longer require total predictability in order to feel alive. This is one of the greatest emotional freedoms a human being can experience, to participate fully in life without trying to imprison life inside your expectations, to love without trying to own, to plan without demanding guarantees, to move forward without needing every answer first, to trust that uncertainty does not automatically mean disaster. This kind of surrender does not weaken you, it stabilizes you, because now your peace is no longer built entirely on external conditions obeying your timeline. Your peace begins growing from something deeper: presence, awareness, flexibility, trust, acceptance, inner grounding. And perhaps the most painful thing about control is this: many people do not even realize how deeply they are trying to force life until life finally refuses to cooperate completely. Only then do they see how exhausted they have become, exhausted from chasing certainty, exhausted from controlling outcomes, exhausted from mentally wrestling reality every day, exhausted from trying to force life into shapes it no longer wants to hold. Sometimes breakdown is not only emotional pain. Sometimes breakdown is the nervous system collapsing under the impossible burden of trying to control everything. And strangely, this collapse can become sacred too. Because once the illusion of control cracks deeply enough, another possibility appears: a quieter way of living, a softer relationship with uncertainty, a deeper trust that life does not need to obey your exact timeline in order for meaning, healing, or transformation to still unfold. This is difficult wisdom because the ego wants guarantees before surrendering. It says, "I will trust life once life proves itself safe." But Buddhist surrender moves differently. It says, "Life was never fully safe or controllable to begin with, and yet I can still learn how to meet it with openness instead of fear." That is real inner strength. Not controlling every outcome, not avoiding every painful change, not forcing certainty onto the future, but remaining emotionally present even when life refuses to follow the script you created. And eventually, after enough suffering, many people begin realizing something surprising. The problem was never only that life changed. The deeper problem was how much of their identity depended on the old structure staying the same. Because when life removes the things your ego built itself around, another kind of collapse begins to happen inside you. And maybe that is why some of the deepest suffering begins when life removes the very things you use to define yourself. Because once control starts collapsing, another fear quietly rises underneath it. If the old identity disappears, who are you without it? If life takes away the role, the relationship, the dream, the image, the future, or the version of yourself you spent years building, what remains underneath all of it? This is where many people begin feeling a kind of emptiness they cannot explain, not because they lost everything physically, but because the identity they emotionally depended on begins falling apart. There is a strange kind of silence that enters your life when the version of yourself you trusted no longer exists. It can happen after heartbreak, after failure, after betrayal, after losing a career, after becoming sick, after being rejected, after watching a dream collapse slowly in front of you. Suddenly, the identity you spent years protecting no longer feels solid, and the mind panics. Because the ego builds itself around attachment. It creates identity through roles, achievements, relationships, validation, routines, plans, and external structures. It says, "This is who I am. This is what gives my life meaning. This is what makes me valuable." And over time, the ego becomes emotionally fused with those things. So when life removes them, it does not simply feel uncomfortable, it feels like psychological death. A person who spent years identifying as successful suddenly loses their career and feels worthless. A person who built their entire identity around being loved suddenly experiences abandonment and feels invisible. A parent whose children grow up and leave home suddenly feels empty because the role that once gave life direction no longer controls their daily existence. A person who always felt needed suddenly enters a season where nobody depends on them anymore, and they begin questioning their entire purpose. This is why identity collapse feels so terrifying. The ego cannot separate who you are from what you have attached yourself to emotionally. Buddhist teachings reveal something most people never realize until life forces them to see it. Much of human identity is temporary construction. It is built from changing conditions. And because those conditions change constantly, the self built around them eventually becomes unstable too. At first, this truth feels threatening. The ego wants certainty. It wants something permanent to hold on to. It wants a fixed identity that cannot be shaken by life. But Buddhism gently points toward something deeper. It teaches that suffering grows when you mistake temporary roles for your true self. You are not only the career, not only the relationship, not only the reputation, not only the success, not only the image you worked so hard to maintain, but the ego becomes deeply attached to these things because they create emotional structure. They make the mind feel solid. They answer the frightening question, "Who am I?" without forcing you to look deeper. As long as life keeps supporting the identity, the ego feels safe. But eventually, life changes shape. And when it does, many people experience a hidden emotional crisis. They may continue functioning outwardly, but internally they feel lost. They no longer recognize themselves. The old motivations disappear. The old confidence weakens. The old future collapses. They begin drifting through life with an uncomfortable feeling that something essential has been stripped away. This often happens quietly. A person may continue going to work every day while secretly feeling disconnected from themselves. Someone may continue smiling socially while grieving the identity they lost after divorce, failure, aging, or emotional exhaustion. Another person may continue achieving externally while internally feeling hollow because the achievements no longer give the same emotional meaning they once did. The world usually misunderstands these moments because externally the person may still appear fine. But internally, identity collapse is happening. And identity collapse feels unbearable because the ego interprets uncertainty about the self as danger. The mind starts asking painful questions. If I am no longer this person, then who am I? If this role disappears, what meaning does my life still have? If people stop seeing me the same way, do I still matter? These questions can feel deeply destabilizing because most people were never taught how much of their emotional identity was built on impermanent things. From childhood, people are conditioned to define themselves externally, through grades, through beauty, through relationships, through status, through success, through productivity, through approval. Society rewards stable identities because stable identities create predictable behavior. But spiritual awakening often begins when those identities crack open, not because suffering is beautiful, but because suffering exposes illusions. As long as life keeps feeding the ego what it wants, many deeper truths remain hidden. A person may never question who they really are while the relationship feels secure. They may never question their dependence on achievement while success keeps arriving. They may never notice how much validation controls them while people continue admiring them. But loss reveals attachment. Loss reveals where identity became emotionally trapped. This is why painful seasons often feel spiritually disorienting. They force you to stand face to face with yourself without the familiar masks, roles, and structures you once used to feel stable. And at first, this can feel unbearable. There is grief in realizing how much of your worth depended on external things staying the same. There is grief in seeing how much energy was spent maintaining identities that life could remove at any moment. There is grief in recognizing that the version of yourself you fought so hard to protect was never fully permanent. But hidden inside this collapse is also freedom, because when false identities begin falling apart, something deeper has space to emerge. Buddhism often describes the ego not as evil, but as confused attachment. The ego constantly seeks security in temporary things. It says, if I can become enough externally, I will finally feel whole internally. But this search never truly ends because external conditions always remain unstable. A successful person fears losing success. A loved person fears abandonment. A respected person fears rejection. A powerful person fears weakness. The ego constantly defends the identities it creates because it secretly knows those identities are fragile. This is why so much human anxiety exists underneath appearances. People are not only afraid of pain, they are afraid of identity collapse. They are afraid of no longer knowing who they are if life changes suddenly, and life always changes eventually. This is why Buddhism teaches non-attachment so deeply, not because you should stop loving or participating in life, but because attaching your entire identity to temporary conditions creates inevitable suffering. If your sense of self depends completely on things outside your control, your inner world becomes permanently unstable. One of the strangest experiences during identity collapse is how empty ordinary life can suddenly feel. Things that once excited you stop carrying emotional energy. Conversations feel shallow. Old goals feel disconnected. The old version of your life no longer fits, but the new version has not yet fully arrived either. This creates an uncomfortable space in between identities, and most people panic inside this space. The ego desperately tries to rebuild itself quickly. It searches for distraction, validation, new relationships, new goals, new identities to replace the old ones immediately, because stillness feels dangerous when you no longer know who you are. But Buddhist surrender asks you not to rush too quickly. It asks you to sit inside the uncertainty long enough to discover what remains when external identities stop defining you completely. This is difficult because modern life constantly pressures people to maintain clear identities. You are expected to know exactly who you are, what you want, where you are going, and how your life should look. Uncertainty is often treated as weakness, but spiritually, uncertainty can become sacred, because uncertainty strips away illusion. When identity collapses, you begin realizing how much of your suffering came from trying to defend images that were never fully real to begin with. You realize how exhausting it was trying to maintain the successful version of yourself, the strong version, the perfect version, the needed version, the chosen version. You realize how much emotional pressure the ego was carrying every single day just to keep those identities alive. And strangely, once life removes what your ego depended on, there can eventually come a strange relief too, not immediately. At first there is grief, confusion, fear, emptiness. But beneath all of that, another possibility quietly appears. The possibility of no longer needing to perform an identity constantly just to feel worthy. This is one of the hidden freedoms inside collapse, because the ego survives through performance. It constantly asks, how am I being seen? Am I enough? Am I succeeding? Do people still value me? But once life breaks the identity apart deeply enough, some people begin growing tired of the performance itself. They begin craving something more honest, more grounded, more real. And this is where deeper transformation starts happening. Not through becoming a better ego, but through loosening identification with the ego altogether. Buddhist wisdom teaches that clinging to a fixed self creates suffering because the self itself is constantly changing. Thoughts change, emotions change, roles change, desires change, bodies change, circumstances change. Yet the ego keeps trying to create permanent identity from impermanent experiences. That effort becomes exhausting, especially during major life transitions. Aging often exposes this deeply. Many people build identity around youth, beauty, strength, productivity, or social relevance. But as the body changes, they experience panic because the ego cannot control time. It cannot stop impermanence. So suffering grows whenever the mind refuses to allow change to happen naturally. The same happens emotionally. People become attached to being the helper, the achiever, the caretaker, the strong one, or the successful one. But eventually life creates situations where those identities crack. And when they crack, people often feel ashamed for struggling because they no longer match the image they built around themselves. This shame deepens suffering, because now they are not only grieving change, they are judging themselves for no longer being who they used to be. But perhaps life was never asking you to stay the same forever. Perhaps part of suffering comes from trying to preserve identities that your soul has already outgrown. This is one of the hardest spiritual truths to accept. Sometimes life removes identities not to destroy you, but to free you from versions of yourself that could no longer carry your growth. The ego interprets this as loss. The soul experiences it as transformation. But transformation rarely feels peaceful at first. It often feels like confusion, like isolation, like emotional death, because before a new inner life can emerge, the old structure usually collapses first. This is why spiritual awakening is often misunderstood romantically. People think awakening feels constantly peaceful and enlightened, but many awakenings begin through breakdown, through disillusionment, through losing the identities you once depended on emotionally. You stop knowing who you are. You stop knowing what you truly want. You stop recognizing the old motivations, and for a while, this uncertainty feels terrifying. But slowly, something important begins happening. You start separating your worth from your roles. You start realizing you still exist even without constant validation. You start noticing that awareness itself remains steady underneath changing identities. The career changes, the relationships change, the emotions change, the body changes. But something deeper continues witnessing all of it quietly. Buddhism calls attention toward this awareness because awareness itself is not trapped in the same fragile identity structures as the ego. Awareness observes thoughts without becoming them completely. It observes fear without turning fear into permanent identity. It watches grief move through the body without believing grief is the entirety of who you are. This changes your relationship with suffering. Instead of saying, "I am ruined," you begin noticing, "Pain is moving through me." Instead of saying, "I have lost myself," you begin realizing the old identity is dissolving. Instead of panicking every time uncertainty appears, you begin allowing yourself to exist without rigid definitions temporarily. This openness creates space for authentic identity to emerge naturally instead of through fear. Because many ego identities are built defensively, people become achievers because they fear worthlessness. They become caretakers because they fear abandonment. They become perfectionists because they fear rejection. They become emotionally independent because they fear vulnerability. But when life interrupts these patterns, deeper truths begin surfacing. You begin seeing the wounds underneath the identity, the loneliness underneath achievement, the fear underneath perfectionism, the exhaustion underneath constant strength. This awareness can feel painful, but it is also healing because now you are finally seeing yourself honestly instead of only through performance. Honesty is where freedom begins. Not the brutal self-criticism many people mistake for honesty, but compassionate truthfulness. The willingness to admit, I built my identity around things that were never stable enough to carry my entire sense of self. There is no shame in this. Most human beings do it unconsciously, but suffering deepens when you refuse to see it. Many people spend years trying to rebuild the exact same ego after collapse. They rush back into old patterns because uncertainty feels unbearable. They seek the same validation, the same external identity, the same emotional dependency, the same performance structures. But sometimes life collapses identities because your deeper self can no longer breathe inside them. This is why some painful endings eventually become turning points. Not because the pain itself was good, but because the collapse forced deeper honesty. It forced reflection. It forced awareness. It interrupted unconscious attachment long enough for transformation to begin. You start asking different questions, not, how do I get my old life back? But, who am I underneath the identities I lost? That question changes everything, because now you are no longer only trying to rebuild externally, you are beginning to awaken internally. And strangely, the more honestly you face identity collapse, the less terrified you become of change itself. You begin understanding that identity is not meant to stay frozen forever. Human beings evolve, consciousness evolves, desires evolve, seasons evolve, life keeps moving. The ego suffers because it keeps trying to hold still, but surrender allows movement. This does not mean you stop caring about your life. It means you stop building your entire existence around fragile external structures. You begin grounding yourself somewhere deeper than constant achievement, approval, control, or performance. That deeper grounding creates inner freedom, not freedom from pain, not freedom from uncertainty, but freedom from constantly needing life to confirm your identity every moment. And perhaps this is why some people emerge softer after collapse instead of harder, more compassionate, more honest, more awake, more emotionally real. They no longer need to prove themselves constantly because suffering already stripped away many illusions they once depended on. There is humility in this kind of awakening. A quiet understanding that life can change at any moment. A quiet awareness that identities come and go. A quiet freedom in no longer clinging so tightly to who you thought you had to be. This freedom does not arrive all at once. At first, there is grief for the old self. There is mourning, confusion, disorientation. But slowly, beneath the collapse, another kind of peace begins growing. A peace not built on performance. A peace not dependent on external identity, a peace that remains even while life continues changing shape, and eventually you begin understanding something deeply important. The collapse of the ego is not always the collapse of your life. Sometimes it is the collapse of the illusion that you were only the identity you built around pain, fear, validation, or control. Sometimes life removes what your ego depended on because your soul is trying to become lighter. And once the old identity finally loosens enough, another unfamiliar season often begins to appear. A season filled with silence. Not the peaceful silence people romanticize, but the strange emptiness that comes after everything you once depended on emotionally falls apart. And maybe that is the part nobody talks about enough. Not just the collapse itself, but what comes after it, the silence, the strange emptiness that arrives when the noise of the old life disappears. Because once the ego loses what it was built around, life often enters a season that feels unfamiliar, quiet, and emotionally empty. And for many people, that silence feels almost unbearable at first. There are seasons in life where nothing seems to happen anymore. The relationship is gone, the old dream has ended, the distractions lose their power, the future feels unclear. Even the version of yourself you once recognized feels distant. And suddenly you are left alone with a kind of silence that feels heavier than noise ever did. This silence can feel frightening because most people spend their lives constantly filling space, filling it with goals, conversations, entertainment, validation, work, relationships, plans, worries, and distractions. The mind stays busy because busyness creates the illusion of stability. As long as something is happening externally, the ego feels protected from having to sit deeply with itself. But when life falls apart, silence enters, and silence exposes everything. It exposes grief that was hidden underneath productivity. It exposes loneliness hidden underneath social connection. It exposes exhaustion hidden underneath achievement. It exposes fear hidden underneath control. Without constant distractions, the soul begins hearing what the noise was helping it avoid. This is why empty seasons often feel emotionally intense. Nothing dramatic may even be happening externally anymore, but internally, the mind feels restless. People often mistake this restlessness for failure. They think, my life is stuck, nothing is moving, I should be doing more. But sometimes life becomes quiet because something deeper inside you is trying to awaken. Buddhist teachings understand this silence differently than the modern world does. Modern culture often worships movement, speed, productivity, and constant stimulation. If nothing visible is happening, people assume something must be wrong. But spiritual growth often happens invisibly first. The deepest transformations usually begin in silence before they appear outwardly. The problem is that the ego hates empty space. Empty space feels threatening because the ego survives through constant activity and identity reinforcement. It wants stimulation because stimulation keeps deeper questions buried. It wants distraction because distraction prevents stillness. It wants movement because movement helps avoid emotional truth. But eventually life creates a pause. And in that pause, many people finally meet themselves honestly for the first time. At first, this meeting can feel uncomfortable. You sit alone with your thoughts and realize how tired your mind has become. You notice how much anxiety was always running underneath your daily life. You notice how deeply you depended on external things to feel emotionally okay. You notice how afraid you are of uncertainty when there is nothing distracting you from it. This realization can feel painful. Some people immediately rush to escape the silence. They jump into new relationships too quickly. They overload themselves with work. They obsess over social media. They seek constant entertainment. They keep themselves emotionally overstimulated because stillness feels unbearable. But no distraction truly heals what silence is trying to reveal. The uncomfortable truth is that many people are not afraid of silence itself. They are afraid of what silence might show them about their inner world. Silence removes performance. It removes escape routes. It removes constant external stimulation. And underneath all of that, unresolved emotions begin rising slowly to the surface. Grief rises, fear rises, loneliness rises, regret rises, questions rise. The ego panics because it wants quick relief. It wants to move on immediately. It wants life to feel normal again. But healing rarely happens through rushing. Some parts of the soul only reveal themselves in stillness. This is why empty seasons can secretly become sacred. Not because suffering itself is beautiful, but because silence creates space for awareness. And awareness changes everything. For the first time, you may begin noticing how much of your life was driven by unconscious fear. You may begin seeing patterns that were invisible before. The need for validation, the fear of abandonment, the obsession with achievement, the constant need to stay busy, the inability to rest peacefully without guilt. These truths often remain hidden during louder seasons of life, but silence slows everything down enough for deeper seeing to happen. Buddhism teaches that clarity rarely arrives through constant mental noise. It emerges when the mind becomes quiet enough to observe itself honestly. This is why meditation exists, not to escape life, but to finally see life clearly without endless distraction. But silence is difficult because the mind is addicted to stimulation. You can see this even in ordinary moments. Many people cannot sit quietly for 5 minutes without reaching for their phone, television, music, conversation, or some kind of distraction. The nervous system has become conditioned to constant input. Stillness feels unnatural. Yet some of the deepest healing in human life begins inside stillness, because stillness allows buried emotional energy to surface and release slowly instead of remaining trapped underneath endless activity. Many people do not realize how much pain they carry until life finally becomes quiet enough for the body to feel it. This is why some people cry unexpectedly during silent moments, while driving alone, while sitting in nature, while lying awake at night, while doing nothing at all. The body finally feels safe enough to release what constant noise was suppressing. Silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors can feel uncomfortable before they become freeing. During empty seasons, people often feel like life has forgotten them. The old excitement disappears, doors seem closed, progress feels invisible, the future remains unclear. This creates frustration because the ego measures worth through visible movement. It says, if nothing is happening, then I must be failing. But spiritually, some seasons are meant for deep internal restructuring rather than external achievement. Nature itself moves this way. Trees appear still during winter, yet deep preparation is happening underground. Seeds disappear into darkness before growth becomes visible. The ocean becomes calm before storms shift direction. Life constantly moves through cycles of expansion and retreat. Human beings are no different, yet modern life teaches people to fear retreat, to fear slowness, to fear silence, to fear emptiness. But some forms of emptiness are not punishment, they are preparation. Preparation for deeper awareness, preparation for emotional honesty, preparation for awakening. One of the hardest parts of silent seasons is that they often remove external reassurance. You no longer receive the same attention, excitement, certainty, or emotional stimulation that once kept you feeling secure. This forces the mind into unfamiliar territory. It can no longer depend on constant outside validation to feel stable. And this is where deeper spiritual work begins. Because now you must learn how to sit with yourself without constantly escaping into external identities. You must learn how to exist without always being distracted from your own inner world. You must learn how to feel emotions without immediately numbing them. This is difficult work, very difficult, especially in a world designed to keep people constantly distracted from themselves. But there is wisdom hidden inside this discomfort. When silence first enters your life, it often feels lonely. But eventually, if you stop fighting it, the silence changes character. What first felt empty slowly begins feeling spacious. What first felt frightening slowly begins feeling calm. The mind gradually stops panicking every time life becomes still. This shift happens slowly. At first, the mind keeps demanding answers. What is happening with my life? Why is nothing moving? When will things change? But over time, something softens. The nervous system begins learning that uncertainty does not automatically equal danger. The heart begins learning that stillness does not automatically mean failure. And from that softening, deeper peace becomes possible. Many awakenings begin this way, not through dramatic spiritual experiences, but through long seasons of quiet, emotional unraveling. A person sits in silence long enough that the old noise loses its control. They stop chasing distraction constantly. They stop running from themselves. They begin observing their thoughts instead of automatically believing them. This creates enormous transformation internally, because once awareness deepens, you begin seeing how noisy the ego truly was. You notice how constantly it demanded stimulation, reassurance, control, validation, and movement. You realize how exhausted your inner world became trying to maintain endless emotional activity. And for the first time, you may begin craving simplicity instead of stimulation. This is one of the hidden gifts of painful seasons. They often make superficial things lose their emotional power. The games no longer feel exciting. Constant validation no longer satisfies deeply. Endless busyness no longer feels meaningful. Something inside you begins searching for depth instead of distraction. This search often begins quietly. A person starts spending more time alone. They begin reflecting more. They begin craving authenticity. They begin questioning old patterns. They become more sensitive to emotional noise. The soul slowly becomes less interested in performance and more interested in truth. This transformation can feel isolating because not everyone around you will understand it. Some people may think you are becoming distant or withdrawn, but internally something sacred may actually be happening. The identity built on distraction is weakening and awareness is becoming stronger. Buddhist teachings often describe awakening as remembering rather than becoming. Beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath the ego's constant demands, there is already a deeper stillness inside you. But most people never notice it because their entire attention remains trapped in mental activity. Silent seasons force attention inward. At first, this feels uncomfortable because the mind has nowhere to run. But eventually, you begin discovering something surprising. The stillness itself is not your enemy. The silence is not attacking you. The emptiness is not trying to destroy you. It is revealing you. This revelation changes your relationship with loneliness too. Many people confuse loneliness with solitude. Loneliness feels like emotional abandonment. Solitude becomes intentional inner connection. During awakening, empty seasons often shift from loneliness into solitude gradually. You begin appreciating quiet moments instead of fearing them constantly. You begin enjoying presence instead of needing endless stimulation. This does not mean pain disappears completely. There may still be grief, still uncertainty, still confusion about the future. But the relationship with those emotions changes. Instead of panicking every time discomfort appears, you begin making space for it gently. You stop treating every difficult feeling like an emergency that must immediately be solved. This creates emotional maturity, because emotionally immature minds demand constant escape from discomfort. Emotionally mature awareness learns how to stay present without collapsing into panic every time life becomes uncertain or quiet. The silence teaches this slowly. It teaches patience. It teaches observation. It teaches surrender. It teaches you how much of your suffering came not from emotions themselves, but from resistance toward emotions. This is why many people eventually emerge wiser from quiet seasons. Not because silence magically fixed them, but because silence removed enough distraction for self-awareness to deepen. And self-awareness changes how you live. You become more conscious of your reactions, more conscious of your fears, more conscious of your attachments, more conscious of the ways the ego constantly seeks escape from uncertainty. This awareness creates freedom because unconscious patterns lose power once they are clearly seen. Many people spend their whole lives reacting automatically to discomfort. If they feel lonely, they immediately seek distraction. If they feel uncertain, they immediately seek control. If they feel empty, they immediately seek stimulation. But silent seasons interrupt these automatic reactions long enough for awareness to enter. Awareness slows everything down. Instead of instantly escaping discomfort, you begin asking, "What is this feeling trying to show me?" Instead of constantly avoiding silence, you begin listening to what silence reveals. This is where awakening quietly begins. Not through perfection, not through becoming emotionally numb, not through controlling life completely, but through becoming deeply honest with your own inner world. Silence often reveals how fragmented the mind has become, thoughts pulling in different directions, emotional wounds left unresolved for years, constant fear about the future, constant regret about the past. The person realizes they were physically alive but rarely fully present. This realization can feel painful at first because awareness exposes disconnection, but awareness also creates healing, because now you are no longer sleepwalking through your emotional life unconsciously. You are beginning to witness yourself clearly, and witnessing yourself clearly is one of the deepest forms of compassion. Many people think awakening means becoming something special, but often awakening is simply becoming more real, more honest, more present, less controlled by unconscious fear, less addicted to distraction, less attached to false identities. This transformation rarely happens during noisy seasons. It happens in silence, in stillness, in waiting, in uncertainty, in the uncomfortable space after everything familiar falls apart. That is why empty seasons are often misunderstood. The ego sees emptiness and assumes nothing valuable is happening. But spiritually, emptiness creates room. Room for truth, room for healing, room for deeper awareness to emerge. Without emptiness, there is no space for renewal. This is why Buddhist philosophy speaks so deeply about emptiness itself, not as meaninglessness, but as openness. Emptiness means life is not fixed, identity is not fixed, suffering is not fixed. Everything remains fluid, changing, unfolding. At first, the ego fears this because it wants permanence, but eventually this truth becomes liberating too. If nothing is fixed, then pain is not permanent either. The confusion will shift, the grief will shift, the emptiness itself will eventually change form. Everything moves, everything transforms, and awareness allows you to move with life instead of constantly resisting its natural cycles. There is also deep humility that grows during silent seasons. The ego slowly loses some of its arrogance. You realize how little external success truly guarantees inner peace. You realize how fragile many human identities actually are. You realize how much emotional suffering exists beneath ordinary appearances. This humility softens people. They become less judgmental, less performative, less obsessed with proving themselves constantly, because silence has already shown them what endless striving could never give. Real peace cannot be built through constant noise. It must be discovered underneath the noise. And perhaps this is why some of the most spiritually awake people often carry a certain calmness inside them. Not because their lives are perfect, but because they have already survived the silence after collapse. They have already sat inside emptiness long enough to realize they would not die from stillness. They no longer panic every time life becomes uncertain or quiet. The silence changed them. It stripped away illusions. It slowed them down. It taught them how to sit with themselves honestly. And eventually, what first felt like emptiness became a doorway into something deeper. A quieter relationship with life. A deeper trust in presence, a softer relationship with uncertainty, an awareness that no external identity can permanently hold the soul together forever. This awakening often happens gradually, almost invisibly. One day you realize the silence no longer terrifies you the same way. You no longer feel the same desperate need to constantly distract yourself. You begin feeling more grounded in simple moments. Breathing, walking, resting, existing. That simplicity carries wisdom, because the ego constantly complicates life through endless mental struggle. But awareness simplifies things again. It reminds you that beneath all the stories, fears, and identities, this moment is enough to return to. This breath, this presence, this quiet awareness underneath all the noise. And once the soul begins tasting this deeper stillness, another realization slowly appears. Many of the things you once chased so desperately were connected to only one imagined future, one outcome, one version of happiness you believed you needed in order to finally feel complete. But life was never meant to arrive through only one doorway. And maybe this is where another hidden form of suffering begins, not only from losing what you loved, but from believing your happiness could only exist through one specific future. One relationship, one dream, one outcome, one path, one version of life. Because when the mind becomes emotionally attached to only one possibility, it slowly loses the ability to see the rest of life clearly. That is how attachment creates blindness. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from believing your entire future depends on one thing working out exactly the way you imagined. The mind becomes emotionally fixed on a single doorway. It says, if this relationship survives, then I'll finally be okay. If I achieve this dream, then my life will finally matter. If this person chooses me, then I'll finally feel worthy. And without realizing it, the heart begins building its entire emotional world around one outcome. At first, this attachment feels like hope. It feels meaningful. It feels passionate. But slowly, the attachment becomes emotional imprisonment. Because once the mind decides happiness can only arrive through one specific future, every other possibility begins disappearing emotionally. The person stops seeing life openly. They stop noticing new paths. They stop appreciating what is still alive in the present. Their entire emotional energy becomes trapped inside protecting, chasing, or waiting for one imagined outcome. And this creates suffering long before anything even falls apart. The anxious attachment begins quietly. The mind constantly checks whether the future is still secure. It overthinks every sign. It fears every delay. It panics over uncertainty because emotionally, too much has been placed on one possibility surviving forever. This is why attachment creates emotional blindness. The person no longer sees reality clearly. They only see what supports the future they are emotionally addicted to. You can see this often in relationships. A person becomes so attached to the idea of one relationship saving them that they ignore obvious suffering. They ignore incompatibility. They ignore emotional neglect. They ignore their own exhaustion. Why? Because they are not only attached to the person, they are attached to the future they built around the person. The mind says, I cannot lose this because my happiness depends on it. And once happiness becomes emotionally fused with one specific outcome, fear takes control. Fear of losing, fear of rejection, fear of uncertainty, fear of change, fear of starting over. This fear slowly distorts perception. Instead of seeing reality honestly, the person begins seeing reality through desperation. They no longer ask, is this healthy? They ask, how do I stop this future from disappearing? That difference changes everything. Buddhist teachings explain that attachment does not only create pain after loss, attachment creates suffering before loss too, because the mind becomes consumed by protecting impermanent things from changing. The heart becomes tense, the nervous system becomes hypervigilant. The person lives in constant emotional negotiation with uncertainty. This is exhausting, because life itself is always moving. People change, circumstances shift, dreams evolve, feelings transform. Nothing remains frozen forever. But attachment demands permanence from temporary things. It says, this must stay exactly as I need it to stay. And when reality refuses to obey, suffering deepens. One of the saddest things about attachment to one future is how it blinds people to the life that is still unfolding around them. A person may spend years emotionally waiting for one specific outcome while missing countless moments of beauty, growth, healing, and possibility happening quietly in the present. Their entire emotional world becomes narrowed. Life loses openness. The soul loses flexibility. The future becomes a rigid emotional contract instead of a living mystery. This rigidity creates enormous pain because reality rarely follows fixed emotional scripts. Sometimes life opens unexpected doors. Sometimes it redirects people completely. Sometimes the path that originally broke your heart later becomes the path that saved your soul. But attachment cannot see this initially. The attached mind only sees the loss of the desired outcome. It cannot yet see hidden possibilities beyond it because emotionally it already decided, This was my only chance at happiness. That belief is deeply dangerous, not because dreams are wrong, not because love is wrong, but because no temporary outcome is stable enough to carry the entire weight of your emotional survival. The moment happiness becomes dependent on one thing happening exactly your way, fear enters the heart immediately. This fear often disguises itself as devotion, ambition, or determination, but underneath it is emotional dependency. The person no longer wants the outcome. They psychologically need it in order to feel whole. And when human beings psychologically need specific outcomes, they begin abandoning themselves, trying to preserve them. They tolerate mistreatment. They ignore intuition. They over-sacrifice. They over-control. They lose emotional balance. Because survival now feels emotionally tied to one future remaining alive. Buddhist wisdom invites you to examine this attachment honestly, not to shame yourself, but to free yourself. Because attachment narrows consciousness. It traps awareness inside obsession. The person becomes unable to see life clearly because emotionally they are staring at only one doorway, while life itself remains infinitely wider. There is also deep grief hidden inside attachment, because attachment often confuses imagined futures with guaranteed realities. The mind rehearses the future repeatedly until it emotionally feels real. A person imagines the marriage, the career, the success, the future family, the peaceful life they believe is coming. And after emotionally living inside that future long enough, the mind begins treating it like certainty. So when life changes direction, the grief becomes overwhelming because the heart feels like something real has died. In many ways, something did die. The imagined future died. The emotional identity connected to that future died. The certainty died. The illusion of guaranteed permanence died. This is why attachment hurts so deeply. The mind was not only attached to an outcome, it was attached to the emotional safety the outcome represented. Many people are not truly attached to things themselves. They are attached to what they believe those things will finally make them feel. Loved, secure, enough, chosen, successful, peaceful, whole. This is important to understand because it changes the way you see desire itself. Beneath most attachments is an emotional longing for inner completion. The ego believes external outcomes will permanently resolve internal discomfort. But even when people achieve their desired future, the mind often creates new fears immediately. A person finds love and becomes afraid of losing it. A person achieves success and becomes afraid of failure. A person gains security and becomes afraid of uncertainty returning. The attachment never truly ends because the ego keeps seeking permanent safety in impermanent experiences. This is why Buddhist teachings point inward instead of outward. They do not say external things are meaningless. They simply remind you that no external future can permanently stabilize the human mind if the mind itself remains deeply attached and fearful. Real peace begins when your emotional survival no longer depends entirely on one future happening exactly the way you imagined. That shift changes how you experience life completely. You still dream, you still love, you still care deeply, but you stop worshipping one specific outcome as though it is your only path to happiness. This creates emotional openness, and emotional openness allows life to move again. The attached mind becomes psychologically frozen. It cannot adapt because adaptation feels like betrayal toward the original dream. Many people secretly stay emotionally trapped in dead futures because letting go feels like admitting the dream failed. But letting go is not always failure. Sometimes letting go is the first honest act of love toward yourself after years of emotional struggle. The ego hates this because the ego equates surrender with defeat. It says, if I release this future, then everything I hoped for meant nothing. But Buddhism teaches something softer. A dream can matter deeply and still not be meant to stay forever. A path can shape your soul, even if it eventually disappears. Nothing is wasted in awareness. Even painful attachment can become wisdom once clearly understood. And often, people only begin seeing their attachment clearly after life removes the outcome they were clinging to. Only then do they realize how narrow their emotional world had become. They realize how much energy was spent trying to force life into one specific shape. This realization can feel devastating at first. A person may suddenly ask themselves, "Who am I without this dream? Who am I if this future never happens? How do I live now?" These questions feel terrifying because attachment built identity around the outcome itself. Without the future, the ego feels directionless. But hidden inside this collapse is another possibility too. The possibility of rediscovering life without obsessive attachment controlling every breath. That rediscovery begins slowly. At first, the person still grieves heavily. They may replay the old future constantly. They may compare reality against what they hoped life would become. They may feel empty because the emotional structure built around the desired outcome has collapsed. But eventually, awareness begins softening the attachment. The person begins seeing how much suffering came from emotional rigidity itself. They realize how much pressure they placed on one relationship, one dream, one timeline, one future to finally save them emotionally. And slowly, they begin breathing differently. Life no longer feels like one narrow tunnel. Other possibilities become visible again. Small joys return quietly. Unexpected peace enters simple moments. The nervous system stops fighting reality constantly. This softening is one of the hidden gifts of surrender, because attachment keeps the heart closed to life as it actually is. The attached mind constantly compares the present against the desired future. If reality does not match the fantasy, the person remains emotionally dissatisfied. But surrender reopens perception. Suddenly the person notices things they ignored before: friendships, quiet beauty, inner growth, unexpected opportunities, different forms of love, new directions, new meanings. Not because the original dream was meaningless, but because consciousness is no longer imprisoned inside only one possibility. This creates emotional freedom. Not freedom from sadness completely, but freedom from the illusion that happiness only exists in one exact form. The ego always wants specific guarantees. It says, peace must look exactly like this. But life rarely unfolds so narrowly. Sometimes the future you originally wanted was connected to a smaller version of yourself. Sometimes life removes one path because your soul is meant to grow beyond it. This does not mean every painful loss is magically positive. Buddhism never asks you to deny grief, but it asks you to stop assuming your mind already knows the only possible form your happiness could ever take. Because the mind is limited by current identity, current fear, and current understanding. Life is larger than the ego's imagination. This becomes clearer over time. Many people eventually look back on painful endings and realize something surprising. The thing they once believed would destroy them permanently eventually opened unexpected growth they could not previously see. The relationship ending forced emotional awakening. The career collapsing redirected their life toward authenticity. The rejection interrupted patterns of self-abandonment. The silence deepened awareness. The uncertainty softened control. But none of this was visible while attachment was still controlling perception. This is why attachment creates blindness. It traps awareness inside emotional fixation. The person becomes unable to see possibilities beyond the desired outcome because emotionally they already decided life can only arrive through one doorway. Yet life is far more mysterious than that. Sometimes what first appears as loss later reveals itself as redirection. Sometimes the dream collapsing prevents deeper suffering. Sometimes the future disappearing saves you from becoming trapped inside a life that no longer aligned with your growth. But attachment cannot trust this initially, because attachment only trusts certainty. It only trusts visible outcomes matching personal desire. This is why surrender requires enormous courage. Not because surrender guarantees easy endings, but because surrender asks you to loosen your grip on the illusion that you already know exactly how life must unfold in order for meaning, love, or peace to still exist. That loosening feels frightening at first. The ego says, if I stop clinging, I will lose everything. But often the opposite becomes true. Once attachment softens, the person finally begins reconnecting with life itself instead of obsessively controlling one version of life. Presence returns, curiosity returns, flexibility returns. The heart becomes softer again. And this softness changes relationships too. People no longer love through desperate possession. They no longer treat others like emotional guarantees against uncertainty. Love becomes freer, calmer, more honest. It stops carrying the crushing pressure of needing another person to permanently rescue inner emptiness. The same happens with dreams. A person may still pursue meaningful goals deeply, but their worth no longer collapses entirely if outcomes shift unexpectedly. They stop seeing delays as proof of failure. They stop seeing uncertainty as proof of disaster. They stop treating every detour like emotional death. This creates resilience, because resilience is not the absence of disappointment. It is the ability to remain emotionally alive even when life changes direction. Attachment struggles with this because attachment wants fixed certainty, but life itself is movement. Seasons shift, paths evolve, human beings transform, awareness deepens. What once felt essential may later feel limiting. The soul evolves faster than the ego often realizes, and perhaps this is why some painful endings eventually become liberating. Not because losing what you loved feels good, but because attachment was narrowing your entire emotional existence around one possibility. Once that attachment loosens, consciousness expands again. The person starts seeing life with new eyes, not eyes trapped in obsessive longing, not eyes trapped in rigid timelines, not eyes trapped in emotional dependency, but eyes capable of meeting life openly again. This openness is deeply healing because attachment creates constant tension inside the nervous system. The body becomes emotionally contracted around protecting one future from disappearing, but surrender relaxes that contraction slowly. The person begins trusting that even if life changes shape, existence itself is still larger than one lost outcome. That trust creates peace, a quieter peace, not the excitement of fantasy, but the grounded peace of emotional openness. The understanding that happiness is not locked inside one relationship, one timeline, one dream, or one future. Happiness is not a single destination waiting somewhere ahead. It is a way of meeting life itself. And once the heart begins understanding this deeply, another realization slowly begins emerging. Sometimes life does not destroy your plans to punish you. Sometimes it removes certain paths because you were walking toward futures your deeper self was never meant to remain trapped inside forever. And perhaps this is one of the hardest truths for the human heart to accept. Sometimes the path that breaks you emotionally is not always the path that destroys you. Sometimes it is the path that redirects you. Because there are moments in life when something falls apart so suddenly, so painfully, that the mind immediately interprets it as punishment. But what if some endings are not life abandoning you? What if they are life protecting you from futures you cannot yet see clearly? There are losses that feel cruel when they first happen. A relationship ends unexpectedly. A door closes right when you thought your future was finally beginning. A plan collapses after years of effort. A dream disappears after you emotionally gave your whole heart to it. In those moments, the mind naturally asks painful questions. Why would life take this away from me? Why would the universe let this happen? Why does it feel like everything I love eventually disappears? At first, the pain feels deeply personal. The ego immediately interprets loss as rejection. It believes the universe is working against you. It sees closed doors as evidence that life is unfair. It sees delay as abandonment. It sees collapse as failure. But Buddhist surrender invites a very different possibility. What if life sometimes interrupts your plans because the path you were forcing was no longer aligned with your deeper growth? This idea is difficult to accept during pain because the ego only judges events by immediate emotional comfort. If something feels good, the ego calls it a blessing. If something hurts, the ego calls it punishment. But life is often more mysterious than immediate emotional reactions can understand. Some things feel painful because they are breaking attachment. Some endings hurt because they are separating you from identities, environments, relationships, or futures that your deeper self was never meant to stay trapped inside forever. But while you are emotionally attached to the old path, you cannot yet see this clearly. This is why painful redirection often feels like betrayal at first. A person loses a relationship they believed would last forever. In the beginning, all they can see is heartbreak. The mind obsesses over what was lost. It cannot imagine happiness existing outside that specific future. But years later, the same person may realize the relationship would have slowly destroyed their peace if it had continued. The loss that once felt unbearable eventually revealed itself as protection. This happens more often than people realize. A career opportunity disappears, and years later the person discovers a path far more aligned with who they truly are. A rejection humiliates someone temporarily, but eventually saves them from environments that would have drained their spirit. A delayed dream forces emotional growth that success alone could never have created. But while you are standing inside the pain itself, you usually cannot see the larger picture. This is where surrender becomes important. Not blind surrender that pretends suffering feels pleasant, but wise surrender that understands human perception is limited. The ego sees only the immediate wound. Awareness gradually sees the transformation unfolding underneath it. The difficulty is that the human mind becomes emotionally attached to its own plans. Once the ego decides how life should unfold, it begins treating that vision like absolute truth. It says, "This is the path that will save me. This is the person I need. This is the future I must have." And when reality interrupts that vision, the ego experiences panic because it cannot yet imagine meaning existing outside the original plan. This creates enormous resistance. The person keeps trying to reopen doors life already closed. They keep trying to force conversations, relationships, outcomes, timelines, and futures that no longer move naturally. They exhaust themselves emotionally, trying to revive paths that life itself keeps dissolving. Buddhist wisdom gently asks a difficult question here. What if some things collapse because your attachment to them became stronger than your awareness of yourself? This is painful to face, honestly, because sometimes people cling to futures not because those futures are truly healthy, but because they fear the emptiness that might appear without them. They stay attached to relationships that shrink them, careers that exhaust them, identities that imprison them emotionally, familiar pain that feels safer than uncertain freedom. The ego prefers familiar suffering over unfamiliar transformation. This is why people often chase things long after those things stop nourishing their soul. The attachment itself becomes addictive. The person believes letting go would destroy them, even while holding on is already destroying their peace, slowly. Life sometimes interrupts these patterns forcefully because the ego would never willingly release them on its own. This interruption can feel brutal initially, because when life removes something your identity depended on, the mind experiences withdrawal. The nervous system panics. The future becomes uncertain. Emotional control disappears. And during that chaos, the ego cannot yet imagine the possibility that the collapse itself may contain hidden intelligence. Buddhist surrender does not require you to instantly label pain as good. It simply asks you to stop assuming pain automatically means destruction. There is wisdom in remaining open to the possibility that life may be guiding you somewhere your current identity cannot yet understand. This openness changes suffering profoundly. Without openness, pain becomes purely bitterness. The mind closes around the wound completely. It says, "Nothing meaningful can come from this. My life is ruined." This loss destroyed everything. But with openness, even grief contains movement, even confusion contains curiosity, even collapse contains the possibility of awakening. That possibility matters deeply, because some of the greatest transformations in human life begin through painful interruption. A person who was emotionally asleep suddenly awakens after heartbreak. Someone who lived entirely for external validation begins searching for inner truth after failure. Someone who built identity around control begins discovering surrender after uncertainty breaks them open. Pain softens illusions, not because suffering itself is magical, but because suffering interrupts unconscious patterns strongly enough to force deeper awareness. As long as life keeps rewarding the ego's habits, many people never question the direction they are moving. They continue chasing approval, status, control, security, or attachment without realizing how disconnected they have become from themselves. But collapse creates interruption, and interruption creates reflection. Reflection changes consciousness. Suddenly, the person begins asking questions they avoided before. Why was I so attached to this? Why did I build my entire identity around one future? Why was I abandoning myself trying to preserve this path? What deeper fear was controlling me underneath all of this? These questions often become the beginning of awakening, not because the pain disappears immediately, but because awareness begins growing larger than the attachment itself. One of the most difficult parts of painful redirection is trust. The ego wants immediate proof that the loss will eventually make sense. It wants certainty before surrendering. It says, "Show me exactly why this happened, and then I will accept it." But life rarely works that way. Often the understanding arrives much later, sometimes years later, sometimes only after enough distance exists for the heart to see clearly. At the time of loss, all you can usually see is the wound itself. This is why surrender requires humility. It asks you to admit that your current perspective may not yet contain the full truth of what is unfolding. It asks you to loosen the ego's certainty that it already knows exactly what should or should not be happening. This humility softens resistance. Instead of saying, "This should never have happened," the heart slowly begins saying, "I do not fully understand this yet, but maybe life is moving in ways larger than my current vision." That shift creates space, and space changes suffering. Without space, the mind becomes trapped inside rigid conclusions. My future is over. Nothing good can come from this. This ruined my life. These conclusions create emotional paralysis because they transform temporary pain into permanent identity. But openness interrupts that rigidity. It allows movement again, not forced positivity, not denial, but gentle willingness to admit the story may not be finished yet. Many people later discover that the path they desperately wanted would have eventually broken them more deeply if life had allowed it to continue. The relationship they worshipped would have slowly drained their spirit. The success they chased would have trapped them inside emptiness. The future they fought for would have disconnected them from themselves. But attachment blinded them. Attachment always narrows perception. The ego sees only what it wants immediately, not always what truly nourishes the soul long-term. This is why surrender becomes wisdom rather than weakness. Surrender allows reality to reveal truths attachment could not see. There is also something deeply compassionate hidden inside painful redirection. Sometimes life collapses your plans because your deeper self is trying to survive. A person may consciously want one thing, while unconsciously that path is harming them emotionally, spiritually, or psychologically. This happens often with people trapped in patterns of self-abandonment. They chase relationships that repeat old wounds. They seek environments that validate unhealthy identities. They pursue dreams built entirely on external validation instead of authentic alignment. The ego calls this purpose, but the soul quietly suffers underneath it. Eventually, life interrupts the pattern, and the interruption feels devastating because the ego interprets it as loss rather than liberation. But liberation often arrives disguised as disruption. This is one of the deepest Buddhist truths about surrender. Sometimes the universe does not remove things to punish you. Sometimes it removes things because you would never stop clinging to them voluntarily. The ego hates hearing this because it still believes control equals safety. But many forms of control are actually emotional imprisonment. A person may cling to toxic certainty simply because uncertainty feels more frightening. Yet uncertainty is often where transformation waits. Without uncertainty, many people would never evolve beyond old identities. They would remain emotionally frozen inside familiar patterns forever. Painful redirection forces movement. It breaks routines. It interrupts emotional addiction. It shakes consciousness awake. This awakening is rarely comfortable. At first, the person feels lost, directionless, confused. The old future is gone, but the new path remains unclear. This in-between space can feel emotionally unbearable because the ego craves certainty immediately. But the in-between space is sacred too. It is where old identities dissolve, where false attachments weaken, where deeper awareness begins forming quietly underneath the surface. Many people try escaping this space too quickly. They rush toward new attachments because emptiness feels unsafe. But rushing often recreates the same unconscious patterns again. The soul needs silence after collapse. It needs space to recalibrate. It needs time to separate authentic desire from ego-driven attachment. This process cannot be forced. That is why surrender requires patience, not passive waiting, but patient openness, the willingness to let life unfold gradually instead of demanding instant emotional resolution. Nature itself moves this way. Storms clear slowly, wounds heal gradually, seasons change in stages. Transformation unfolds organically, yet the anxious ego constantly tries to accelerate healing because discomfort feels threatening. It says, I need answers now. I need certainty now. I need my future restored immediately. But sometimes deeper wisdom only grows through waiting. Waiting humbles the ego. Waiting softens control. Waiting teaches trust. Not trust that everything will unfold exactly according to your preferences, but trust that your life can still carry meaning even when the path changes unexpectedly. This kind of trust creates inner stability. Without it, every disruption feels catastrophic. Every delay feels personal. Every closed door feels like rejection from existence itself. But with trust, painful, redirection begins looking different. The person still grieves honestly, but they stop treating the collapse as proof that life has abandoned them permanently. This changes emotional energy profoundly. Instead of spending years fighting reality, the person slowly begins listening to reality. They stop demanding that life restore the old path exactly as it was. They begin asking deeper questions instead. What is this season trying to teach me? What patterns are becoming visible? What parts of myself are awakening through this pain? These questions open consciousness. The person becomes less obsessed with controlling outcomes and more interested in understanding themselves honestly. This is where real spiritual maturity begins, not through perfect circumstances, but through developing awareness inside imperfect circumstances. A mature soul understands something the ego struggles to accept. Life is not always trying to satisfy your immediate desires. Sometimes it is trying to deepen your consciousness. And consciousness often grows most during disruption. This does not mean you should become passive or stop pursuing meaningful goals. Buddhist surrender is not resignation. It is alignment. It is learning how to move with life instead of constantly warring against it emotionally. A surrendered person may still work hard, love deeply, and pursue dreams passionately. But they stop treating outcomes like absolute guarantees for inner worth. They stop collapsing every time life changes direction unexpectedly. This creates emotional resilience, not because pain disappears, but because awareness becomes larger than attachment. The person begins understanding that identity, meaning, and peace are not dependent on one rigid future surviving forever. Life remains alive beyond any single outcome. This understanding softens desperation. And desperation is often what creates the deepest suffering. Desperation clings, desperation controls, desperation panics whenever reality shifts. But surrender breathes differently. It allows movement, it allows mystery, it allows life to unfold without needing every answer immediately. Many people later realize their greatest awakenings began through experiences they once called disasters. The breakup that forced self-respect, the failure that revealed authentic purpose, the collapse that interrupted emotional addiction, the silence that deepened awareness, the uncertainty that softened control. At the time, these moments felt cruel. Later, they revealed hidden mercy, not because suffering itself was desirable, but because the old path could no longer support the soul's deeper growth. This realization creates compassion toward your own journey. You stop judging yourself only through temporary outcomes. You stop treating painful redirection as evidence that you are cursed, forgotten, or unworthy. You begin understanding that life is often far more complex than the ego's immediate interpretations. This complexity requires surrender because the human mind cannot always see the larger unfolding while standing inside the storm itself. Sometimes clarity only arrives after enough healing creates distance from attachment. Sometimes what first looked like destruction eventually reveals itself as protection. And perhaps this is why Buddhist surrender asks you not to worship your plans too completely. Plans matter, dreams matter, love matters, but life itself remains larger than your current imagination. The ego wants guarantees before trusting life, but deeper peace begins when you stop demanding guarantees from an impermanent world. That peace does not arrive through controlling every outcome. It arrives through learning how to remain open even while life keeps changing shape. And eventually, after enough painful redirection, many people begin realizing something surprising. The problem was never only that life changed their plans. The deeper fear was what remained after the collapse, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, the terrifying possibility of having to begin again when the soul already feels tired. And maybe this is where the heart becomes truly tired, not only from losing the old path, but from realizing life is asking you to begin again when you no longer feel emotionally strong enough to start over. Because there are moments after deep disappointment when the soul does not fear pain anymore as much as it fears exhaustion. The exhaustion of rebuilding, the exhaustion of hoping again, the exhaustion of carrying yourself forward after everything inside you already feels worn down. There is a kind of emotional exhaustion that changes the way a person sees life. It is not simple tiredness that sleep can fix. It is deeper than that. It comes after too many disappointments, too many losses too. Many attempts to hold everything together while quietly falling apart inside. And eventually, when life asks you to let go of an old chapter and begin again, the heart whispers something painful. I do not know if I have the strength to start over one more time. This fear keeps many people emotionally trapped long after life itself has already moved forward. The relationship ended years ago, but emotionally they are still standing inside it. The dream collapsed long ago, but internally they still replay it every day. The rejection happened once, yet the mind keeps reliving it endlessly. The old version of life is already gone, but the soul refuses to fully leave the ruins behind. This happens because emotional exhaustion weakens the ability to trust new beginnings. Starting over requires energy, it requires openness, it requires vulnerability. And after enough pain, many people no longer fear failure itself as much as they fear having to survive another collapse. So instead of moving forward fully, they stay psychologically connected to dead chapters. Not because those chapters are still alive, but because the unknown future feels even more frightening than familiar pain. This is one of the deepest traps of suffering. Familiar suffering can begin feeling emotionally safer than uncertain healing. The mind says, "At least I know this pain. At least this heartbreak feels predictable. At least this disappointment is familiar." And because the nervous system craves emotional familiarity, people unconsciously cling to old pain rather than risk new uncertainty. Buddhist teachings understand this deeply. The mind becomes attached not only to pleasure, but also to familiar identity structures built around suffering. A person can become emotionally attached to sadness, victimhood, longing, regret, or hopelessness because those emotions become psychologically familiar over time. This does not mean people consciously want suffering. Most do not. But the nervous system often prefers predictable pain over unfamiliar change because uncertainty feels threatening to survival. That is why emotionally exhausted people often struggle to release the past fully. The old pain may hurt, but the future feels emotionally shapeless. And shapelessness terrifies the ego because the ego survives through certainty, even painful certainty. You can see this in people who remain emotionally attached to relationships that already ended internally long before they physically ended. They know the relationship no longer brings peace. They know they are exhausted. They know they are shrinking themselves emotionally. But leaving means facing uncertainty. Leaving means facing emptiness. Leaving means rebuilding identity. And emotionally, that feels overwhelming. So they stay, not because the situation is healthy, but because exhaustion makes transformation feel impossible. The same thing happens after major life failures. A person loses confidence after enough disappointments and slowly stops believing they can survive new attempts emotionally. They stop dreaming openly. They stop trusting possibility. They stop taking risks. Not because they no longer desire happiness, but because emotional exhaustion convinces them hope itself is dangerous. This is heartbreaking because the person is no longer only grieving the past. They are grieving their own lost energy for life. Buddhist surrender becomes especially important here because exhausted minds often confuse surrender with defeat. They think letting go means giving up completely. But true surrender is not hopelessness. It is the willingness to stop carrying what is already emotionally dead. That difference matters deeply. An exhausted person often continues carrying dead emotional weight long after life itself has moved on. Old conversations, old regrets, old fantasies, old pain, old identities. The mind becomes a graveyard of unfinished emotional attachment, and this constant emotional carrying drains life force slowly. You may have felt this before. The body becomes heavy. Simple tasks feel harder. Joy disappears from ordinary moments. Even small decisions feel overwhelming. This happens because emotional exhaustion is not only mental. The nervous system itself becomes overwhelmed from carrying unresolved emotional resistance for too long. The body was never meant to live in constant emotional warfare. Yet many people spend years internally fighting reality, fighting what happened, fighting what ended, fighting what changed, fighting who they used to be, and eventually the soul becomes tired, not lazy, not weak, just deeply tired. There is an important difference. Many emotionally exhausted people judge themselves harshly because they no longer feel motivated the way they once did. They compare themselves to their past energy. They compare themselves to other people. They think they are failing spiritually or emotionally because they cannot simply move on. But often the problem is not lack of strength. The problem is that the nervous system has been overloaded by unresolved grief, fear, control, disappointment, and emotional suppression for too long. The soul needs gentleness during these seasons, not punishment. Buddhist compassion becomes essential here because compassion softens the violence many people direct toward themselves internally. An exhausted person often hears cruel thoughts constantly. Why can't I get over this? Why am I still stuck? Why am I so weak? Why does life feel so hard for me? But these thoughts only deepen exhaustion further, because healing cannot grow in an environment of constant self-attack. Sometimes emotional exhaustion is the body begging you to stop fighting yourself, to stop forcing timelines, to stop carrying identities that no longer fit, to stop trying to emotionally resurrect futures that are already gone, to stop demanding impossible strength from a wounded heart every single day. This is why rest becomes sacred in Buddhist philosophy. Not only physical rest, but emotional rest. Rest from overthinking, rest from obsession, rest from trying to control outcomes constantly, rest from replaying pain endlessly. An exhausted mind often believes rest is dangerous because stillness allows unresolved emotions to surface. So the person keeps themselves mentally busy even while deeply drained internally. They scroll endlessly, distract themselves constantly, overwork, overanalyze, overconsume stimulation. But overstimulation cannot heal exhaustion. It only numbs it temporarily. True healing often begins when the person finally becomes honest about how tired they truly are emotionally. Not tired of life itself, but tired of carrying so much unprocessed pain alone. There is courage in admitting exhaustion honestly, because many people spend years pretending they are okay while quietly collapsing internally. They continue performing strength for everyone else while secretly feeling emotionally numb inside. But eventually the performance itself becomes unsustainable. The soul can only fake aliveness for so long before deeper truth begins surfacing. And sometimes that truth sounds like this: I cannot keep living the way I have been living, not dramatically, not violently, just honestly. This honesty becomes a turning point because now awareness can finally enter. The person stops pretending endless emotional struggle is normal. They stop glorifying suffering. They stop identifying with exhaustion completely. This matters because emotionally exhausted people often begin seeing exhaustion as their permanent identity. They say things like, "This is just who I am now. I'll never feel light again. Life permanently broke me." But exhaustion is not identity. It is a condition of the nervous system and heart after carrying too much for too long. Conditions can change. This is one of the deepest Buddhist truths about suffering. Everything moves, everything shifts. Even emotional exhaustion itself is impermanent. But the exhausted mind struggles to believe this because pain narrows perception. It makes the future feel emotionally frozen. This is why starting over feels terrifying. Not because new beginnings are always bad, but because exhausted consciousness cannot yet imagine feeling alive again. The person becomes emotionally trapped inside survival mode. Their world becomes smaller, simpler, focused only on avoiding further pain. This creates emotional stagnation. Life continues moving externally, but internally the person stops evolving because fear now controls movement. They avoid vulnerability, avoid hope, avoid emotional openness, avoid possibility itself. Yet hidden inside this fear is another painful truth. Many people are not only afraid of beginning again, they are afraid of grieving again, because grief is exhausting. Loving again means risking loss again. Dreaming again means risking disappointment again. Trusting again means risking betrayal again. And after enough emotional pain, the heart becomes cautious, very cautious. The ego says, never put yourself in that position again. But this protection often becomes imprisonment, because avoiding pain completely also blocks aliveness completely. Buddhist surrender does not ask you to recklessly force yourself into new beginnings before you are ready. It asks something gentler first. It asks you to stop living emotionally inside chapters that have already ended. This is where awareness becomes healing. You begin noticing how much energy goes toward mentally reliving the past, replaying conversations, imagining different outcomes, revisiting old memories, rehearsing regrets, fantasizing about impossible reversals. The mind keeps returning to the old chapter because emotionally it still hopes control might somehow restore what was lost. But life has already moved, and until awareness accepts this deeply, exhaustion continues. Because emotional resistance consumes enormous life energy. The body carries tension, the heart carries unfinished grief. The mind carries endless mental loops. No wonder exhausted people struggle to imagine beginning again. They are already using all their energy trying to hold on to what no longer exists. This is why letting go creates relief eventually, not immediate happiness, not instant healing, but relief. Because the nervous system slowly stops fighting reality every second, the person begins releasing the impossible task of emotionally carrying dead futures forever, and from that release, energy slowly begins returning. Very slowly at first. An exhausted soul does not heal dramatically overnight. Healing usually begins through small moments. A slightly calmer breath, a morning where the pain feels less sharp, a brief moment of curiosity returning, a small experience of peace without guilt. These moments matter deeply because they remind the nervous system that life still exists beyond survival. Many emotionally exhausted people forget what it feels like to simply exist without carrying constant internal pressure. They become so used to emotional heaviness that lightness feels unfamiliar. But awareness slowly reintroduces lightness gently, not through forcing positivity, not through pretending pain never happened, but through softening resistance, through allowing rest, through releasing impossible expectations, through stopping the endless internal war. There is also deep healing in realizing you do not need to rebuild your entire life all at once. Exhausted people often panic because they imagine starting over as one massive, impossible task. The future feels overwhelming. The mind says, "How do I rebuild everything?" But healing rarely happens through giant dramatic leaps. It happens breath by breath, choice by choice, moment by moment. One honest conversation, one small act of self-care, one boundary, one quiet realization. One day survived differently. Buddhist teachings constantly return attention to the present moment for this reason. The exhausted mind keeps trying to solve the entire future immediately, and this creates even more overwhelm. But healing only happens now, in this breath, in this moment, in this small act of awareness. Presence protects exhausted hearts from drowning in overwhelming futures. And slowly, presence creates enough safety for the soul to begin opening again. This opening feels fragile at first. The person may still fear disappointment, still fear uncertainty, still fear trusting life again. But awareness allows these fears to exist without completely controlling behavior anymore. That is growth, not the disappearance of fear, but the gradual loosening of fear's control. An emotionally exhausted person often believes they have lost themselves permanently, but often they are simply between identities. The old version has collapsed, but the new version has not fully emerged yet. This in-between space feels empty because the ego no longer knows how to define itself clearly. Yet this emptiness is sacred too, because identities rebuilt too quickly are often built from fear again. The soul sometimes needs silence after collapse, time to breathe, time to feel honestly, time to reconnect with what actually matters underneath all the noise. This reconnection creates different priorities eventually. Things that once seemed urgent lose emotional intensity. Things once ignored become meaningful. Presence matters more. Peace matters more. Authenticity matters more. The person becomes less interested in chasing appearances and more interested in protecting inner stability. This wisdom often grows specifically through exhaustion, because exhaustion exposes what endless striving could never satisfy. At some point, the soul simply becomes too tired to keep pretending certain forms of suffering are worth it anymore. And strangely, that exhaustion can become liberating. Not because being exhausted feels good, but because exhaustion strips away illusions. The illusion that endless control will finally create safety. The illusion that external validation will permanently heal insecurity. The illusion that clinging to dead chapters will somehow restore life. Exhaustion humbles the ego. It forces surrender. And surrender creates space for deeper healing. Not healing built on force, but healing built on gentleness. This gentleness is what emotionally exhausted people often need. Most yet deny themselves completely. They continue demanding strength instead of offering compassion. They continue pushing instead of resting. They continue judging instead of understanding. But awareness changes the inner relationship slowly. The person begins speaking to themselves differently. Not, "Why am I still broken?" but "Of course I'm tired after carrying this for so long." Not, "I should already be over this." But healing moves in layers. Not, "I have failed because I need rest." But rest is part of becoming whole again. These shifts matter deeply because the nervous system responds to inner language. Harshness creates contraction. Compassion creates safety, and safety is what allows healing to unfold. Eventually, after enough surrender, the exhausted soul begins noticing something quietly beautiful. Life did not fully disappear during the collapse. The sky still changes colors. Music still touches the heart. Moments of peace still arrive unexpectedly. The body still breathes. Awareness still exists underneath the pain. This realization becomes the beginning of trust returning slowly. Not trust in perfect outcomes, not trust that life will never hurt again, but trust that even after devastation, something alive still remains within you. And maybe that is the deeper miracle hidden underneath emotional exhaustion. Not that suffering never happened, but that consciousness itself survived it. The soul survived it. And now, very slowly, life is asking something new. Not to force yourself into another perfect future immediately. Not to become fearless overnight. But to stop fighting the reality that has already happened so your exhausted heart can finally begin resting inside truth instead of resistance. And maybe this is where healing finally begins to move differently. Not through forcing yourself to become stronger overnight, and not through pretending the pain never happened, but through something much quieter, the willingness to stop arguing with reality. Because after enough exhaustion, the soul slowly realizes something painful but freeing at the same time. The event already happened. The ending already happened. The loss already happened. And no amount of inner resistance can change what reality has already become. Yet the mind keeps fighting anyway. There is a silent war many people carry inside themselves every day. It is not always visible from the outside. A person may continue going to work, smiling, speaking normally, and functioning through ordinary life, while internally they are trapped in constant resistance against the past. One part of the mind knows reality has changed. Another part refuses to emotionally accept it, and that resistance creates suffering that never fully rests. The mind replays conversations endlessly. It imagines different outcomes. It negotiates with memories. It rewrites scenarios. It obsesses over what should have happened. And all of this mental activity creates the illusion that the past is still emotionally unfinished. But the past itself is already over. This is one of the hardest truths Buddhist teachings ask you to face. Reality has already moved. Life has already changed shape. and inner peace cannot fully enter while the mind remains committed to emotionally fighting what already exists. This does not mean the pain was small. It does not mean the loss was fair. It does not mean you should stop grieving. But grief and resistance are not the same thing. Grief honors what was lost. Resistance refuses to accept that it is gone. That difference changes everything. Many people believe their suffering comes only from what happened to them, but often a large part of suffering comes from the endless inner battle against what cannot be changed anymore. The mind keeps saying, "This should not have happened. This cannot be my life. I refuse to accept this reality." At first, this resistance feels understandable. The heart naturally wants to protect itself from pain. But over time, resistance becomes emotional imprisonment, because reality does not disappear simply because the mind keeps rejecting it. And the more energy you spend mentally fighting reality, the more exhausted your inner world becomes. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when attachment collides with impermanence. The ego becomes attached to how life was supposed to unfold, and when reality moves differently, the ego experiences emotional shock. Instead of adapting gradually, it begins waging war against what is already true. This war is deeply draining. You can feel it physically sometimes. Tightness in the chest, anxiety in the stomach, constant tension in the body, exhaustion after overthinking for hours, sleepless nights replaying things you cannot change. The nervous system becomes trapped in survival mode because resistance keeps convincing the body that the threat is still happening right now. But often the event itself ended long ago. The relationship ended. The opportunity disappeared. The betrayal happened. The chapter closed. Yet internally, the mind keeps reliving the moment again and again because emotionally it still refuses to release the fight. This is why acceptance becomes sacred in Buddhist practice. Not because acceptance feels easy, but because acceptance ends unnecessary warfare. Acceptance says, "I may not like this reality, but I can no longer destroy myself trying to erase it." That sentence alone carries enormous healing. Many people misunderstand acceptance because they think acceptance means approval. They believe accepting reality means saying what happened was okay. But acceptance is not agreement. Acceptance is honesty. It is seeing clearly what already exists without endlessly arguing against it internally. A person can accept heartbreak without liking heartbreak, accept failure without glorifying failure, accept loss without pretending loss feels good. Acceptance simply means you stop demanding reality become different before allowing yourself to begin healing. This is difficult because the ego constantly believes peace exists on the other side of changing the past. It says, if I can just understand enough, replay enough, think enough, maybe I can emotionally undo what happened. But the mind cannot heal through endless rewinding. In fact, endless rewinding deepens suffering because it keeps the nervous system emotionally trapped inside the same wound repeatedly. This is why awareness matters so deeply. Awareness allows you to notice when the mind is resisting reality instead of meeting reality honestly. You begin catching the mental loops as they happen, the replaying, the bargaining, the fantasizing, the emotional negotiations with the past. And instead of automatically following those thoughts endlessly, awareness gently interrupts them. This already happened. That chapter is over. I cannot heal while emotionally fighting reality every day. These realizations feel painful at first because resistance often becomes part of identity. Some people become so emotionally attached to their suffering that letting go of resistance feels like betraying the depth of what they lost. But healing does not dishonor pain. Healing honors life continuing. There is a quiet wisdom that begins appearing once resistance softens. The person starts realizing how much energy was being consumed by inner argument. They notice how exhausting it was, trying to mentally force reality backward constantly. They notice how much of their emotional suffering came not only from the event itself, but from refusing to allow the event to fully become part of reality internally. This is why surrender creates relief eventually, not because the pain instantly disappears, but because the nervous system finally stops carrying the impossible burden of trying to undo what already exists. There is enormous exhaustion in fighting reality, and there is enormous peace in finally putting the sword down. This does not happen instantly. The ego does not surrender all at once. At first, the mind keeps returning to resistance automatically. A memory appears, and immediately the inner argument begins again. Why did this happen? How could they do this? What if I had done things differently? This should not have ended this way. But slowly, awareness begins interrupting the cycle more gently, not with force, not with self-judgment, but with truth. It already happened. This pain is real, and I cannot heal while pretending reality should still be something else. This truth softens the nervous system over time. One of the deepest Buddhist practices is learning how to stay present with painful reality without immediately trying to escape, control, or deny it. This is difficult because the human mind constantly seeks escape routes. It wants distraction, certainty, explanations, reversals, anything that prevents fully feeling what is here. But healing only happens inside reality, not outside it. This means eventually you must become willing to feel grief without mentally turning it into resistance. You must become willing to sit with sadness without trying to rewrite the past constantly. You must become willing to let painful truths exist without emotionally collapsing every time they appear. This is strength, quiet strength, not dramatic strength, not performative strength, but the strength required to remain present with life as it actually is. Many people never fully develop this because they spend their lives escaping discomfort automatically. If something hurts, they distract themselves. If uncertainty appears, they seek control. If grief arises, they suppress it. But avoidance only delays healing. The unprocessed pain continues living underneath the surface quietly. Buddhist surrender invites another path. Instead of asking, how do I erase this pain? The question becomes, how do I stop adding more suffering on top of this pain? That shift changes everything, because pain itself is often unavoidable in human life. Loss happens, change happens, disappointment happens, but resistance multiplies pain unnecessarily by turning every difficult experience into prolonged inner warfare. A person loses someone they love, and now they suffer the grief itself, plus the constant mental resistance toward the grief. A person fails, and now they suffer the disappointment, plus endless self-attack and shame. A person experiences rejection, and now they suffer the heartbreak, plus years of mentally replaying the rejection as proof of worthlessness. The event ends. The resistance continues. This continuation is where suffering deepens. There comes a moment in healing where the soul quietly realizes something important. The past no longer needs punishment. It no longer needs endless mental review. It no longer needs constant emotional resurrection. The nervous system is simply tired. Tired of fighting, tired of carrying, tired of reliving. And perhaps that tiredness itself becomes sacred because it finally creates willingness to surrender, not surrender to hopelessness, surrender to truth, the truth that reality already happened. And fighting reality forever only destroys the present moment too. This realization often creates grief again initially, because once resistance weakens, the person finally feels the raw sadness underneath it fully. Resistance often acts like emotional armor. It keeps the mind busy fighting so the deeper vulnerability underneath remains hidden. But when the fight stops, grief becomes softer and more honest. No longer dramatic, no longer obsessive, just real. This is where compassion becomes deeply important, because people often judge themselves for still hurting after letting go of resistance. They think acceptance should instantly remove pain, but acceptance does not erase emotion immediately. It simply stops unnecessary emotional warfare from continuing. Healing still moves gradually. The body still needs time. The heart still needs tenderness. The nervous system still needs safety. But now the energy once trapped inside resistance becomes available for healing instead. This creates subtle changes. The breath deepens slightly. The mind becomes quieter for small moments. The body relaxes more often. Sleep slowly improves. The obsession weakens. Life begins feeling less emotionally sharp all the time. Not because the past disappeared, but because the fight against the past softened. There is also deep wisdom in understanding that reality itself is neutral. The mind creates enormous suffering through the stories it attaches to events. The breakup happened, the failure happened, the loss happened, but the ego adds additional layers constantly. This ruined my life. I'll never recover. I lost my only chance. I'm permanently broken. These stories intensify suffering dramatically because they transform temporary pain into permanent identity. Awareness interrupts these stories gently. It notices the difference between the event itself and the catastrophic meaning the mind keeps attaching to it. This does not mean becoming emotionally numb. It means becoming more conscious of how thought patterns either deepen suffering or soften it. A person can feel sadness without turning sadness into hopelessness, feel grief without turning grief into identity, feel disappointment without turning disappointment into self-hatred. This awareness creates emotional freedom slowly, because now the mind is no longer completely possessed by every painful thought that arises. You begin seeing thoughts as mental events, not absolute truths. The thought says, "My future is ruined." Awareness notices, fear is speaking. The thought says, "I should still have that life." Awareness notices, resistance is here again. This simple noticing weakens suffering because awareness creates space between consciousness and reaction. That space matters enormously. Without space, pain controls behavior automatically. With space, wisdom becomes possible. This is why meditation exists so centrally in Buddhist practice. Meditation trains the mind to observe without immediately clinging, resisting, or identifying completely with every emotional experience. Over time, this changes your relationship with suffering itself. You begin understanding that emotions move like weather, thoughts move like clouds, experiences arise and pass. Even intense pain shifts eventually. But resistance keeps emotional weather trapped artificially inside the mind. Many people unknowingly spend years emotionally preserving storms that life itself was trying to move through naturally. This preservation happens through obsession, resentment, denial, fantasy, and endless mental replaying. The person unknowingly becomes attached to the suffering itself because suffering feels connected to identity now. This is why some people fear acceptance unconsciously. They worry that if they stop fighting the past, the pain will lose significance. But peace does not erase meaning. Acceptance does not dishonor love. Letting go of resistance does not mean the experience never mattered. It simply means your life matters too. Your peace matters too. Your present moment matters too. And eventually there comes a point where continuing to fight reality costs more suffering than surrendering to truth. That moment changes everything internally. The person begins choosing peace over replaying, presence over obsession, reality over fantasy, compassion over self-punishment. This choice does not happen once forever. It happens repeatedly. Again and again the mind returns to resistance. Again and again, awareness gently returns to acceptance. This repetition itself becomes practice, a sacred practice of returning to reality without violence toward yourself. Some days the acceptance feels easier. Other days grief rises strongly again. This is normal. Healing is not linear. The goal is not perfect emotional control. The goal is reducing unnecessary suffering created by resistance. And slowly, this practice transforms the nervous system. The body learns it no longer needs to stay trapped in emergency mode forever. The heart learns painful memories can exist without destroying the present moment. The mind learns uncertainty can be survived without endless overthinking. This creates deeper trust in life gradually, not naive trust that nothing painful will ever happen again, but grounded trust that reality can be faced honestly without collapsing internally every time life changes shape. That trust becomes the beginning of freedom. Because freedom is not controlling everything. Freedom is no longer being emotionally imprisoned by what cannot be changed. Many people spend years believing healing means changing the past emotionally somehow. But healing is actually learning how to remain fully alive, even though the past cannot be changed anymore. This shift is profound. The energy once spent fighting reality becomes available for living reality instead. And living reality opens new possibilities, new awareness, new peace, new relationships with yourself. The past no longer controls every emotional movement completely because the inner war finally begins ending. There is softness in this ending, not weakness, softness. The kind of softness that comes when the heart no longer needs to defend itself against reality every moment. This softness allows something new to emerge. A calmer relationship with uncertainty, a gentler relationship with memory, a quieter nervous system, a deeper ability to remain present even while life continues changing. And perhaps this is why Buddhist surrender is ultimately an act of compassion toward yourself. Not giving up on life, not becoming passive, but finally releasing the impossible burden of mentally fighting what already exists. Because reality has already happened, the chapter already ended, the change already arrived. And your soul deserves freedom from carrying endless resistance against truths life has already written. Yet even after resistance begins softening, another fear often rises quietly underneath it. A fear so deep that many people would rather stay trapped in familiar suffering than fully face it. The fear of the unknown itself. And maybe this is the fear hidden underneath almost every form of resistance. Not only the fear of pain, but the fear of not knowing what comes next. Because once the old life collapses and the mind can no longer return to what felt familiar, another terrifying reality appears in front of the ego. The unknown. The empty space where certainty used to live. And for the human mind, uncertainty often feels less like openness and more like death itself. There is something deeply unsettling about not knowing who you will become after life changes you. The ego wants maps, plans, predictions. It wants emotional guarantees that the future will still contain safety, love, meaning, and identity. But when life removes certainty, the mind begins panicking because uncertainty feels like standing at the edge of a cliff without being able to see the ground below. This is why surrender feels terrifying at first, not because surrender is inherently dangerous, but because surrender removes the illusion of control the ego depended on emotionally. And without control, the ego feels exposed. There is a primitive fear inside human beings that reacts strongly to uncertainty. The nervous system prefers what is familiar because familiarity creates predictability. Even painful situations can feel emotionally safer than unknown possibilities because at least the mind understands the rules of familiar suffering. The unknown has no clear rules, no guaranteed outcomes, no visible structure, and this creates deep psychological discomfort. You can see this everywhere in human behavior. People remain in relationships that hurt them because loneliness feels more uncertain. People stay in careers that drain them because starting over feels terrifying. People continue unhealthy emotional patterns because transformation feels emotionally unfamiliar. The ego clings to certainty, even when certainty itself is causing suffering. This is one of the great paradoxes of human life. The mind desperately wants freedom, but it also fears the uncertainty freedom requires. Because freedom means stepping beyond familiar identity, beyond familiar pain, beyond familiar emotional structures, and the ego interprets that movement as danger. Buddhist teachings understand this deeply. The ego constantly seeks permanence in a world built on impermanence. It wants fixed identity, fixed relationships, fixed outcomes, fixed safety. But life itself is movement. Change is natural. Uncertainty is natural. Transformation is natural. Yet the ego resists all of it because uncertainty threatens the illusion of psychological control. This is why the mind often reacts to uncertainty with anxiety immediately. Anxiety is frequently the nervous system trying to prepare for futures it cannot fully predict. The ego believes constant mental activity might somehow reduce uncertainty, so it overthinks, plans obsessively, rehearses worst-case scenarios, searches endlessly for reassurance. But uncertainty remains anyway, and eventually the person becomes exhausted from trying to mentally solve life before life has even unfolded. This exhaustion creates suffering because the ego refuses to accept a truth Buddhism teaches repeatedly: certainty is temporary illusion. Even during stable seasons, life remains uncertain underneath appearances. Relationships can change, bodies can change, circumstances can shift suddenly. Nothing external stays frozen permanently. The ego hates this truth because uncertainty feels like loss of identity. If nothing is fully guaranteed, then the ego cannot completely relax into external conditions forever. It realizes control was never absolute. This realization creates fear, deep fear, not always visible fear, but subtle fear living underneath daily behavior. Fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of being alone, fear of becoming nobody, fear of not knowing what comes next. All these fears share one root: uncertainty. The ego constantly asks, what if I cannot survive what I cannot predict? This question controls many human lives unconsciously. People organize their entire existence trying to avoid uncertainty emotionally. They seek predictable relationships, predictable identities, predictable routines, predictable emotional experiences. Not because predictability always creates happiness, but because predictability calms the ego temporarily. But life itself refuses to remain fully predictable, and this creates ongoing tension between reality and the mind. Reality flows. The ego resists. Reality changes. The ego panics. Reality dissolves old forms. The ego clings harder. This conflict creates enormous suffering. One of the reasons uncertainty feels so unbearable is because the ego equates uncertainty with annihilation. If the future becomes unclear, the ego immediately assumes danger. It imagines collapse, rejection, loneliness, failure, or death. The mind catastrophizes because uncertainty activates survival instincts deeply rooted inside the nervous system. This is why even small uncertainties can create overwhelming emotional reactions sometimes. A delayed message, a sudden change, an unclear future, a relationship shift. The mind immediately begins filling empty space with fearful stories because uncertainty itself feels emotionally unsafe. But uncertainty is not always danger. Sometimes uncertainty is simply openness before clarity arrives. This distinction changes everything. The ego sees uncertainty and assumes destruction. Awareness sees uncertainty and recognizes possibility. This is where Buddhist surrender transforms perception slowly. Instead of automatically treating uncertainty as an enemy, surrender teaches you to remain present without needing immediate answers constantly. At first, this feels terrifying because the ego wants certainty before it feels safe enough to relax. It says, Tell me exactly what will happen, and then I will stop worrying. But life never fully provides this guarantee, and so the anxious mind stays trapped in endless preparation, preparing for rejection, preparing for failure, preparing for pain, preparing for futures that may never even happen. This preparation becomes a form of emotional self-protection. The ego believes if it anticipates enough suffering mentally, it will somehow reduce future pain. But usually this only destroys peace in the present moment. Because now the person is suffering from imagined futures, while reality itself has not yet even arrived. Buddhism calls attention back to the present repeatedly because the present moment is the only place where life actually exists. The mind lives in future fear and past regret constantly, but awareness returns gently to now. This breath, this moment, this experience, not the imagined disaster, not the catastrophic fantasy, not the future story the ego keeps creating, the present. At first, emotionally exhausted people struggle with this deeply because the nervous system has become addicted to anticipating danger. The body stays tense automatically. Relaxation feels unsafe because vigilance became survival. This often happens after painful experiences. A person who has been hurt deeply begins fearing uncertainty even more intensely afterward. The ego says, "Never let yourself be surprised again." So the mind starts monitoring everything constantly. Relationships become overanalyzed. Future plans become obsessive. Emotional safety becomes dependent on certainty, but certainty itself remains impossible, and this creates endless anxiety. One of the deepest Buddhist truths is that peace does not come from controlling uncertainty completely. Peace comes from changing your relationship with uncertainty itself. That shift is enormous. Because now the goal is no longer eliminating the unknown. The goal becomes remaining grounded while the unknown exists. This is true inner stability, not the illusion that life will never change, but the ability to remain emotionally present even while life changes continuously. This kind of presence feels almost impossible at first because the ego has spent years treating uncertainty like an emergency. The nervous system reacts automatically. Fear rises immediately. Catastrophic thinking begins instantly. But awareness slowly interrupts this cycle. You begin noticing the fear instead of becoming fully possessed by it. You begin noticing the stories the mind creates around uncertainty. You begin noticing how quickly the ego tries turning openness into disaster mentally. This noticing creates space, and space softens panic. For example, uncertainty in relationships often creates enormous suffering because the ego craves guarantees of permanence. It wants reassurance that love will never change, never leave, never disappear. But relationships are living experiences between changing human beings. Nothing about them is permanently fixed. The ego struggles deeply with this. It says, if I cannot guarantee this person will stay forever, how can I feel safe? And this fear creates attachment, control, jealousy, anxiety, and emotional dependence. But surrender teaches another possibility. You can love deeply without demanding permanent guarantees from life. You can care fully while still understanding impermanence exists. This creates calmer love, not detached love, not numb love, but less possessive love. Love no longer built entirely on fear of loss. The same applies to dreams and identity. The ego wants certainty that your future will unfold exactly according to plan. But life rarely moves in straight lines. Paths change, people evolve, purposes deepen, entire identities transform through experience. The ego fears this because it wants fixed structure. But the soul often grows through uncertainty specifically. Without uncertainty, many people would never awaken beyond rigid identities. They would never discover deeper awareness. They would never question unconscious attachments. Uncertainty forces consciousness to expand because old maps stop working. This expansion feels terrifying initially because the ego interprets loss of certainty as loss of self. And in some ways it is. The old self built on certainty begins dissolving. This is why surrender often feels like death emotionally. Something inside you is dying, not your deepest awareness, but the identity structure that depended on control, prediction, and certainty to feel stable. The ego experiences this dissolution as crisis, but spiritually it can become liberation. Because once the old identity weakens, something softer becomes possible. A life less dominated by fear, less controlled by constant anticipation, less trapped inside mental rehearsal. This transformation does not happen overnight. The mind keeps returning to fear repeatedly. What if things never improve? What if I fail again? What if I cannot handle the future? These thoughts arise naturally because the ego still wants certainty desperately, but awareness changes how you relate to these thoughts. Instead of automatically believing every fear, you begin observing fear itself. This is uncertainty triggering anxiety. This is the ego demanding guarantees again. This is the mind trying to predict what cannot yet be known. This awareness weakens fear's control gradually. The body begins realizing uncertainty itself is survivable. That realization changes everything internally because many people spend their entire lives unconsciously believing uncertainty will destroy them emotionally. But when you stay present through uncertain seasons without collapsing completely, the nervous system slowly learns something new. You can survive not knowing. You can survive openness. You can survive transitions. You can survive life-changing shape. This learning creates resilience deeper than certainty ever could. Certainty creates temporary comfort. Surrender creates inner strength. The difference is important. A person dependent entirely on certainty becomes emotionally fragile because any disruption threatens identity immediately. But a person who learns how to remain present inside uncertainty develops flexibility, adaptability, inner grounding. This grounding becomes peace, not because uncertainty disappears, but because the relationship with uncertainty transforms. Instead of constantly fighting the unknown, the person begins allowing life to unfold gradually without demanding immediate control over every outcome. This creates enormous emotional relief, because the nervous system no longer carries the impossible burden of predicting and controlling everything constantly. There is also humility inside surrender. The ego secretly believes it already knows exactly what should happen in order for life to feel meaningful, but uncertainty reminds you that existence remains larger than your current understanding. Some experiences only make sense later. Some paths only reveal purpose after detours. Some endings only reveal hidden mercy through time. This does not mean every painful event has a simple explanation. Buddhism does not force artificial meaning onto suffering, but surrender allows openness to the possibility that reality may contain wisdom beyond immediate emotional reactions. The ego resists this because it wants immediate clarity, immediate certainty, immediate resolution. But life often unfolds through mystery first. This mystery feels uncomfortable because modern culture worships control. People are taught to optimize everything, predict everything, secure everything. Yet, human existence remains deeply uncertain underneath all attempts at control. Aging is uncertain. Love is uncertain. Health is uncertain. The future is uncertain. And strangely, once you stop demanding certainty from life constantly, life becomes lighter emotionally, not easier necessarily, but lighter. Because now the mind is no longer carrying impossible expectations. The person stops asking life to guarantee permanence before allowing themselves peace. This changes daily experience profoundly. The breath deepens, overthinking weakens slightly, the body softens. The present moment becomes more visible again. There is less emotional desperation around outcomes. This does not mean becoming passive or careless. It means becoming less psychologically dependent on certainty itself. And this dependence is what often creates so much suffering. The ego constantly postpones peace until uncertainty disappears. I'll relax once I know the answer. I'll feel safe once the future is guaranteed. I'll feel okay once everything becomes clear. But clarity itself constantly changes. Life continues moving. So peace remains delayed endlessly. Surrender interrupts this cycle by teaching you how to exist peacefully even while uncertainty remains present. That is real freedom, not controlling the unknown completely, but no longer fearing the unknown so deeply that it controls your entire emotional life. Eventually, after enough awareness, the person begins noticing something surprising. The unknown itself was never the true enemy. The deeper suffering came from the ego's desperate resistance toward not knowing, and once resistance softens, uncertainty changes character. It no longer feels only like danger. It also begins feeling like openness, like possibility, like space for transformation. This shift is subtle but profound, because now the future no longer needs to be fully predictable in order for life to still feel meaningful. The person begins trusting themselves more deeply, trusting awareness, trusting presence, trusting that even if life changes unexpectedly, consciousness itself can remain grounded. That trust becomes a new kind of safety, not external certainty, internal steadiness. And perhaps this is the deeper invitation hidden inside surrender. Not to eliminate uncertainty forever, but to stop treating uncertainty like proof that life is against you. Because uncertainty is not punishment, it is part of being alive. And once the mind finally stops demanding complete guarantees from an impermanent world, something beautiful begins happening quietly. The heart becomes softer, less defensive, less controlling, less terrified of change. And from that softness, another truth slowly begins emerging. The life you originally planned may never fully return. But that does not mean life itself is over. And maybe this is the moment where something inside you finally becomes too tired to keep holding on so tightly. Not because all the questions have been answered, and not because the pain suddenly disappears overnight, but because the soul slowly realizes something deeper than control. Life does not always become peaceful when everything finally makes sense. Sometimes peace begins the moment you stop forcing life to explain itself immediately. There is a strange kind of relief that arrives when a person finally lets go. Not dramatic relief, not loud happiness, not sudden perfection. It is quieter than that, softer, almost difficult to notice at first, like the body slowly unclenching after carrying tension for years without realizing how heavy it had become. This peace surprises many people because they spent so long believing peace would arrive through answers, closure, certainty, or restored control. They believed they needed life to return to the original plan before they could finally breathe again. But eventually, after enough exhaustion, something shifts inside them. The endless fighting begins losing its energy, and in that moment, peace quietly enters through the space resistance leaves behind. At first, letting go feels terrifying because the ego interprets letting go as losing. The mind says, if I stop holding on, then everything meant nothing. If I stop searching for answers, then the pain wins. If I stop forcing clarity, then I'm giving up. But true surrender is not giving up on life. It is giving up the endless war against reality. That difference changes everything internally. Many people spend years emotionally gripping things that are already gone. Old relationships, old identities, old futures, old pain. The mind becomes convinced that holding on proves loyalty, depth, or love. But often holding on is simply fear wearing emotional clothing. Fear of emptiness, fear of uncertainty, fear of beginning again, fear of existing without the old story. And because of this fear, the mind keeps reopening wounds long after life itself has already moved forward. This creates exhaustion. Not only emotional exhaustion, but spiritual exhaustion. The soul becomes tired from carrying unresolved tension every day. The body remains alert. The nervous system stays contracted. Thoughts loop endlessly. The heart never fully rests. Then, eventually, something unexpected happens. The person reaches a point where they can no longer continue fighting at the same intensity, not because they suddenly understand everything, but because suffering itself becomes too heavy to carry forever. And strangely, this breaking point often becomes the doorway to peace, because once the ego loses enough energy, surrender becomes possible, not forced surrender, natural surrender. The kind that happens when the soul finally whispers, "I cannot keep destroying myself trying to control what already happened." This moment is sacred, not dramatic, not perfect, but deeply sacred. Because for the first time, the person stops demanding that life become different before allowing themselves to rest emotionally. And that rest changes the nervous system immediately. The breath becomes softer. The mind slows slightly. The body relaxes in ways it has not for years. Not because every problem disappears, but because the inner war weakens. There is enormous relief in no longer carrying the impossible responsibility of forcing life to make sense immediately. The ego desperately wants explanations because explanations create temporary feelings of control. The mind believes that if it can fully understand every painful event, then peace will finally arrive. So it keeps analyzing, replaying, searching, questioning. Why? Did this happen? What did I do wrong? What was the lesson? What if I had chosen differently? But many forms of suffering cannot be solved through endless analysis. Some wounds soften only through acceptance, time, presence, and surrender. This is difficult for the ego because the ego believes understanding must come before peace. But often peace comes first, and understanding arrives later, sometimes years later, sometimes never fully. And this is where letting go becomes transformative. Letting go means you stop making your emotional survival dependent on fully solving every mystery life presents. You stop demanding immediate clarity from an uncertain world. This creates emotional spaciousness. Without spaciousness, the mind suffocates itself through obsession. Every unanswered question becomes an emergency. Every uncertainty becomes unbearable. Every painful memory becomes a courtroom where the ego endlessly searches for someone to blame. But surrender interrupts this pattern gently. The person begins saying, "Maybe I do not need to understand everything right now in order to begin healing." That sentence alone carries enormous freedom, because the mind has spent years postponing peace until complete certainty arrives. Yet certainty never fully arrives. Life keeps moving. Questions remain unanswered. Some losses never explain themselves perfectly, and still healing remains possible. This realization changes the relationship with pain profoundly. The person no longer treats unresolved emotions like enemies that must be defeated immediately. They begin making space for discomfort instead of fighting it constantly. They begin allowing grief to move naturally instead of endlessly resisting it. This softens suffering, not instantly, but gradually. There is also something deeply humbling about surrender. The ego secretly believes it should fully understand life at all times. It believes every painful event must have immediate meaning visible to the mind. But human understanding is limited. Life often unfolds in ways larger than current awareness can fully grasp. Surrender accepts this humbly, not passively, not hopelessly, but honestly. It says, "I may not understand this yet, but I no longer want to destroy myself trying to force understanding before it's time." This honesty calms the nervous system because the pressure to mentally control existence weakens. Many people do not realize how much anxiety comes from the need to immediately resolve uncertainty emotionally. The mind keeps chasing closure, but closure itself is often misunderstood. Closure is not always receiving perfect answers. Sometimes closure is simply deciding you no longer want to bleed endlessly from the same wound. That decision creates peace slowly, a quieter peace, a mature peace. Not the excitement of getting everything you wanted, but the relief of no longer fighting reality every moment. This peace often feels strange initially because many people have spent so long identifying with struggle that calmness feels unfamiliar. They become accustomed to emotional intensity, overthinking, and internal tension. So when surrender begins softening the mind, the silence can feel almost uncomfortable at first. But eventually the body recognizes the difference. There is less panic, less obsession, less emotional desperation. The person begins experiencing moments where the pain is still present, but no longer controlling every thought constantly. These moments matter deeply because they reveal something important. You can still carry sadness without being consumed by suffering. You can still remember without endlessly reliving. You can still grieve without destroying yourself mentally. This is one of the deepest forms of emotional freedom. The ego often believes letting go means forgetting. But letting go is not forgetting. It is releasing the compulsive emotional attachment that keeps reopening the wound endlessly. A person can still love what was lost and no longer destroy themselves trying to bring it back. That is surrender. And surrender creates energy again. Energy once trapped in obsession slowly becomes available for living. This is why many people feel physically lighter after finally releasing old emotional battles. The body itself was carrying resistance. Muscles stayed tense. Thoughts stayed hyperactive. Emotions stayed trapped in loops. But once resistance weakens, the nervous system begins recovering. Sleep improves slowly. Presence returns gradually. Joy becomes possible again in small moments, not because life became perfect, but because the inner war stopped consuming all available energy. There is also deep wisdom hidden inside, realizing that life does not always need immediate explanation in order to still contain meaning. The ego constantly wants clean narratives, clear endings, obvious reasons. But existence often unfolds through mystery. Some relationships end without full closure. Some losses never explain themselves clearly. Some paths disappear without warning. And still, life continues moving. At first, this uncertainty feels unbearable because the ego believes unanswered questions equal emotional danger. But over time, surrender teaches another truth. You do not need to solve every mystery before allowing yourself peace. This realization is liberating, because now the mind no longer needs to obsess, constantly trying to force final answers from reality. Instead, awareness becomes more important than explanation. Presence becomes more important than certainty. Peace becomes more important than winning the argument against life. This shift changes the way people experience healing itself. Healing stops becoming a desperate race toward emotional perfection. It becomes gentler, more human, more patient. The person stops demanding that every painful feeling disappear immediately. They stop measuring progress obsessively. They stop treating temporary sadness as failure. Instead, they begin trusting gradual softening. This trust matters deeply because healing rarely arrives dramatically. Most healing happens quietly. One calmer reaction, one less obsessive thought, one moment of peace that lasts slightly longer than before. These small shifts are profound. They show the nervous system is no longer trapped in permanent emergency mode. There is also enormous freedom in realizing you no longer need the past to become different in order to move forward. Many people unknowingly tie their future peace to impossible conditions. I can only heal if they apologize. I can only move on if I fully understand why. I can only be happy if life gives me back what I lost. These conditions imprison the heart because they place healing entirely outside present awareness. But surrender removes these conditions gradually. The person begins understanding that healing belongs to them now, not to future explanations or restored outcomes. This creates emotional independence, not coldness, not detachment from love, but freedom from making peace dependent on external resolution. This is deeply empowering because now the person no longer waits for life to become perfect before allowing themselves to breathe again. They stop postponing peace endlessly. And perhaps this is why surrender feels so strange at first. The ego spent years believing survival depended on holding tighter, controlling harder, understanding more, resisting longer. But eventually the soul discovers another truth. Peace often arrives through release, not control. Through softness, not force. Through acceptance, not endless mental warfare. This realization transforms relationships too. The person stops trying to emotionally force people into permanence. They stop gripping every outcome desperately. They stop demanding impossible certainty from life. This creates calmer love, calmer ambition, calmer existence itself. Because now awareness understands something the ego resisted for years. Life is not fully controllable, and strangely, that truth no longer feels terrifying. It begins feeling freeing. There is tremendous relief in no longer carrying the impossible burden of controlling every future outcome emotionally. The nervous system finally realizes it can rest sometimes. It can exist without constant vigilance. It can stop preparing for disaster every second. This does not mean pain never returns. Old grief may still rise sometimes, memories may still ache, uncertainty may still appear, but the relationship with these experiences changes completely. The person no longer panics every time discomfort arises. They no longer interpret emotional pain as proof that something is wrong with them. They stop turning every difficult feeling into catastrophic identity. This creates emotional maturity, not emotional numbness. Emotional spaciousness, the ability to let feelings move through consciousness without becoming trapped inside them permanently. Buddhist teachings often point toward this spaciousness because spaciousness allows life to breathe again. Without spaciousness, the ego suffocates existence through endless attachment, fear, and control. But surrender opens the windows internally. Air enters again, presence enters again. Life enters again. And eventually the person notices something surprising. The world did not end when they finally stopped forcing life to make immediate sense. The sky still exists. The body still breathes. Small moments still carry beauty. The heart still remains capable of connection. Awareness itself remains untouched underneath changing emotions. This realization creates deep inner steadiness, not because everything is solved, but because the person no longer needs everything solved before allowing themselves peace. That is profound freedom. Many people spend their whole lives waiting for perfect clarity before relaxing emotionally. But life rarely provides complete certainty. Surrender teaches you how to live inside mystery without constantly collapsing into fear. This is one of the deepest spiritual awakenings possible. The realization that peace is not found through controlling existence completely. Peace is found through softening your resistance toward existence itself. And once this softening begins, another truth slowly becomes visible. The life you originally planned may never fully return, but the version of you emerging through surrender may become far more peaceful than the person who first created those plans. Sometimes life breaks the version you planned because the person you were becoming could no longer grow inside the old story. And maybe that is the hardest lesson surrender teaches. Not every ending is punishment. Not every delay is rejection. Not every collapse is the end of your life. Some losses arrive to wake you up. Some painful seasons arrive to soften the ego, loosen attachment, and guide you back toward yourself. Tonight, We walked through the hidden grief of losing old dreams, the suffering created by resistance, the fear of uncertainty, the exhaustion of carrying dead chapters, and the strange peace that begins when you finally stop fighting reality. And beneath all of it was one deeper truth. Peace does not come from controlling life completely. Peace begins when you stop demanding that life obey the version you once planned. Because life will change, people will leave, dreams will evolve, identities will collapse, but your soul is still capable of healing, awakening, and beginning again. And maybe one day, you will look back at the season that broke you and quietly realize it was also the season that freed you. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, leave a comment below and share the moment life forced you to let go of a version you thought you needed. Someone reading your words may realize they are not alone in their own season of surrender. And if you are ready to keep healing, growing, and finding peace through Buddhist wisdom, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us.